Hi friends. If you're enjoying my videos, please hit the like button. It helps the YouTube algorithm notice me. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The film studies project seemed straightforward enough at first. Choose a topic, conduct research, compile the information, and perhaps gain some insight along the way. When my friend Antonio and I registered for Professor Weber's documentary class that autumn semester, we anticipated a pleasant diversion from our usual academic routine. The assignment parameters were uncomplicated. Create a short documentary about a subject of our choosing. However, being ambitious students with a natural competitive streak, we decided to undertake something more substantial. A project that would distinguish our work from our classmates, and more importantly, explore a topic we found genuinely intriguing. That decision led us deep into Hargrove Forest, just 30 miles from our university campus. Our objective was to examine and ultimately disprove the local legends that had kept most people away from this woodland for generations. Despite its reputation, Hargrove possessed an undeniable beauty. Towering oak and maple trees with dense foliage, undergrowth teeming with wildlife, and a distinctive stillness that initially seemed therapeutic. Yet that silence possessed a certain weight, an atmosphere that felt expectant, as though the entire forest was anticipating some imminent event. The folklore surrounding Hargrove Forest dated back centuries. Indigenous communities once inhabited the area, considering the forest sacred ground, the typical foundation for countless American haunted locations. Over time, tales of apparitions, malevolent entities, and occult ceremonies emerged. In my estimation, these were merely antiquated myths that became increasingly exaggerated as they passed through successive generations. "This is perfect documentary material," Antonio said as we reviewed our preliminary research notes in my apartment. "We'll demonstrate how these legends develop and persist, despite having no factual basis." "Exactly," I replied, scanning through old newspaper clippings about the forest. "We've got historical context, contemporary accounts, and plenty of atmospheric footage potential. Professor Weber will eat this up." The majority of local residents avoided Hargrove entirely, while the few who ventured inside often returned with accounts of negative energies and inexplicable sensations. Antonio and I, both firmly grounded in rationality, dismissed these reports as manifestations of pre-existing fears and suggestion. We viewed superstition as an intellectual weakness and considered ourselves immune to such psychological vulnerabilities. "What if we stay overnight?" Antonio suggested, his excitement visibly building. "That would add incredible authenticity to our project." I hesitated momentarily before agreeing. We could capture some phenomenal night footage. The contrast between daytime and nighttime perceptions of the same location would be compelling. Our documentary would systematically dismantle each superstition and reveal Hargrove Forest as nothing more than an ordinary woodland area, albeit one with an unusually captivating atmosphere. Little did we understand that our academic exercise would transform into something far more harrowing. The following 3 weeks involved intensive preparation. We interviewed local historians, reviewed archival materials, and consulted with our university's anthropology department about the indigenous history of the region. The more we learned, the more convinced we became that Hargrove's reputation stemmed from misunderstandings and deliberate embellishments. Professor Jameson from the anthropology department provided valuable context during our meeting. The Naskapi people considered certain natural locations as thresholds between worlds, he explained, adjusting his glasses. But their concept of other worlds was more metaphorical than literal, representing states of consciousness rather than physical realms. "So, nothing supernatural," I clarified, making notes. "Their beliefs were spiritual but grounded in natural phenomena," he continued. "Modern interpretations have distorted these concepts significantly." Antonio and I compiled local newspaper reports spanning the past century. The earliest accounts described Hargrove merely as unsettling or strangely quiet. By the 1940s, stories mentioned disembodied voices and unexplained lights. The 1970s introduced claims of satanic cults performing rituals, while the most recent accounts included elaborate tales of apparitions and mysterious disappearances, none substantiated by official records. "Notice how the stories become progressively more dramatic," Antonio observed as we organized our timeline. "Classic urban legend evolution." We acquired specialized equipment for our expedition. High-definition cameras with night vision capabilities, sensitive audio recorders, thermal imaging devices, and environmental sensors to monitor temperature fluctuations. We weren't attempting to detect paranormal activity, but rather to document the absence of anomalies while creating compelling visual material. The evening before our scheduled departure, we reviewed our shooting script and equipment checklist one final time. Our plan included specific filming locations, interview questions for any hikers we might encounter, and contingency procedures for inclement weather. "What about cell reception?" I asked, suddenly concerned about communication. Antonio checked his phone. "Coverage maps show it's spotty but not entirely absent. We should maintain intermittent connectivity." "Perfect," I replied. "We'll keep location services active throughout, just as a precaution." We planned to begin filming at dawn, capturing the forest awakening in natural light before documenting specific locations mentioned in the legends. Our itinerary included several caves, an abandoned ranger station, and a clearing where purported rituals had occurred. We would remain until after midnight, documenting the forest's transition from day to night. That evening, I experienced an unexpected moment of apprehension while packing my equipment. A text message from my mother, who knew nothing of our specific plans, arrived with uncanny timing. "Be careful tomorrow. Trust your instincts." I dismissed the coincidence and continued preparing, yet the message lingered in my thoughts as I drove to meet Antonio the following morning. We arrived at Hargrove Forest shortly after sunrise on a crisp October morning. The parking area, little more than a gravel clearing at the trailhead, was completely deserted. Orange and yellow leaves carpeted the ground, creating a striking contrast against the remaining green foliage. Antonio and I distributed the equipment between our backpacks, activated our recording devices, and began our journey into the woodland. "Initial impressions of Hargrove Forest," I narrated for our documentary's opening sequence. "Time is 7:42 a.m. Temperature approximately 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Conditions are ideal for filming. Clear skies with minimal wind." Antonio captured establishing shots of the forest entrance while I continued the narration. "For generations, this ordinary woodland has inspired extraordinary fears. Today, we'll examine these legends through an objective lens and demonstrate how human psychology creates monsters from shadows." The initial hours progressed smoothly. We documented the terrain's gradual transition from sparse edge growth to denser interior woodland. Bird calls and insect sounds provided natural ambient audio, though we both remarked on the relative quietness compared to other forests we'd visited. "Notice how the sounds seem dampened?" Antonio commented while adjusting his microphone settings. "Probably due to the density of the undergrowth absorbing acoustic energy, but it certainly contributes to the unsettling atmosphere people report." By midday, we'd covered approximately 4 miles of trails, capturing footage of several locations mentioned in the legends: a lightning-struck oak tree allegedly used for hangings, a small stream where spectral children were supposedly heard playing, and a moss-covered stone formation that resembled an altar. Nothing we encountered suggested anything beyond natural formation and coincidental resemblance. "This is proving exactly what we hypothesized," I said during our lunch break. "Everything has a rational explanation." Antonio nodded while reviewing the morning's footage on his camera's display. "The footage looks great. The lighting through these trees creates naturally eerie effects without any enhancement." After lunch, we ventured deeper into the forest, following a deteriorating trail toward the abandoned ranger station. The path narrowed considerably, forcing us to navigate increasingly difficult terrain. The tree canopy thickened overhead, reducing the available light and necessitating camera adjustments. "The temperature has dropped noticeably," I observed, consulting our environmental sensor. "Nearly 8 degrees cooler than the forest entrance, which is significant over such a short distance." "Microclimate effects," Antonio replied, though his tone carried less certainty than before. As afternoon transitioned toward evening, subtle changes occurred in the forest atmosphere. The sporadic bird calls diminished until they ceased entirely. The characteristic rustling of woodland creatures became intermittent, then absent. Even the gentle breeze that had persisted throughout the day seemed to still. "Audio check," I whispered into my microphone. "Time is 5:17 p.m. Ambient sounds have decreased significantly within the past hour." Antonio scanned our surroundings with growing unease. "Could be the approaching evening. Many woodland species reduce activity during transition periods. Yet we both recognized something distinctive in this silence, a quality that transcended normal environmental shifts. The forest hadn't simply grown quiet. It had become unnaturally still, as though sound itself was being absorbed by some unseen presence. "Let's continue toward the ranger station," I suggested, attempting to maintain our original plan despite mounting discomfort. "We should reach it before darkness falls completely." We resumed walking, our footsteps suddenly conspicuous against the background silence. Each snapping twig or rustling leaf produced by our movement seemed to reverberate with unnatural clarity. Neither of us spoke as we proceeded, communicating instead through glances and gestures. The ranger station appeared unexpectedly, a dilapidated wooden structure partially reclaimed by vegetation. Its windows remained intact, but were darkened with accumulated grime. The entrance door hung partially open, revealing a shadowed interior. "Perfect location for the evening filming sequence," Antonio whispered, though his enthusiasm had noticeably diminished. I approached the structure cautiously, filming its exterior from multiple angles. "This ranger station was abandoned in 1997 following budget reallocation," I narrated. "Local legends claim forest rangers reported unusual occurrences here, including equipment malfunctions and disembodied voices. These accounts likely stem from natural phenomena, wind through structural openings, wildlife sounds misinterpreted in isolation, and the psychological effects of prolonged solitude." As I concluded my narration, a distinct sound emerged from within the station, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against wood. Antonio and I exchanged alarmed glances. The sound continued for approximately 10 seconds before ceasing abruptly. "Probably an animal," I rationalized, though my voice betrayed uncertainty. "A woodpecker or squirrel inside the structure." "Let's check it out," Antonio replied, his documentary filmmaker instincts briefly overriding caution. We approached the entrance together, camera lights illuminating the darkened interior. The single-room structure contained little beyond an abandoned desk, toppled chair, and metal filing cabinet. No animals or obvious sources for the tapping sound were visible. "Temperature reading is showing a significant drop," I noted, consulting our sensor. "Nearly 15 degrees colder inside than outside." "Thermal isolation effect," Antonio suggested, though his explanation sounded hollow even to my sympathetic ears. We conducted a thorough examination of the station interior, documenting each corner despite our growing discomfort. As daylight continued fading, we decided against remaining there overnight as originally planned. "Let's explore the caves instead," I proposed. "They've featured more prominently in the legends anyway." The relief on Antonio's face was evident as we departed the ranger station, heading toward the cave system approximately half a mile deeper into the forest. Twilight descended rapidly as we navigated toward the cave system. Our headlamps created bobbing illumination that transformed the forest into a disorienting landscape of shifting shadows and indistinct shapes. The complete absence of wildlife sounds persisted, creating an acoustic vacuum filled only by our breathing and footsteps. "Check your cell reception," I suggested, suddenly concerned about our increasingly isolated position. Antonio examined his phone. "1 bar, intermittent, GPS still functioning though." The cave entrance appeared gradually, a dark, horizontal fissure in a limestone outcropping, partially concealed by overgrown vegetation. According to local legends, these caves had served as shelter for indigenous communities during harsh winters and later became hideouts for fugitives during Prohibition. More recent stories claimed they contained evidence of occult activities. "Hartwell Cave System," I narrated for our documentary. "Formed approximately 12,000 years ago through limestone erosion. The entrance measures roughly 7 feet high by 12 feet wide." We positioned our equipment carefully, establishing lighting to capture the cave's entrance from multiple angles. The cave mouth exhaled cool air that carried a distinct mineral scent and something else, a subtle organic odor reminiscent of decay. "Let's examine the interior," Antonio suggested, activating his camera's night vision function. "Just the entrance chamber for now." We proceeded cautiously, documenting the gradual transition from external forest to subterranean environment. The entrance chamber extended approximately 30 feet inward before branching into 3 narrower passages. Mineral formations created fascinating patterns along the walls and ceiling, calcium deposits that gleamed under our lights like organic sculptures. These natural formations likely inspired many supernatural interpretations, I commented, filming a particularly striking stalactite arrangement. Human tendency toward pareidolia, recognizing patterns and faces in random stimuli, could easily perceive these as intentional carvings or symbols. Antonio positioned his camera to capture the unique way exterior light filtered through the entrance, creating atmospheric beams that illuminated swirling dust particles. "This lighting effect is phenomenal," he remarked. "The way the light refracts would appear almost supernatural on camera without proper context." As we ventured deeper into the entrance chamber, the cave's acoustics became increasingly evident. Our voices returned with subtle distortion, not quite echoes, but altered reproductions that seemed slightly out of synchronization with our speech. This acoustic anomaly created a disquieting impression of additional presences just beyond perception. "The audio distortion is remarkable," I observed, recording a sound test. "No wonder visitors report hearing voices or whispers. The cave's natural acoustics create audio illusions." We spent approximately 40 minutes documenting the entrance chamber before selecting the central passage for further exploration. This corridor narrowed considerably, requiring us to proceed single file while carrying our equipment. The ceiling height decreased until we needed to stoop slightly to avoid contact with overhead formations. Approximately 50 feet into this passage, the corridor widened into a secondary chamber with ceiling height sufficient for comfortable standing. This space featured more elaborate mineral formations and evidence of water activity. A small pool of still water occupied the chamber's far corner, its surface perfectly motionless in the undisturbed environment. "This chamber would be ideal for our night filming sequence," I suggested, scanning the space with my headlamp. "The acoustics are particularly interesting, and these formations create compelling shadow patterns." Antonio nodded in agreement as he established our primary lighting arrangement. We positioned cameras to capture multiple angles simultaneously and prepared our audio equipment for optimal recording in the unusual acoustic environment. As we finalized our setup, a subtle shift occurred in the cave atmosphere. The temperature decreased perceptibly, not dramatically, but noticeably enough to register on our environmental sensors. The air movement within the chamber altered, transitioning from the gentle outward flow we'd observed upon entering to absolute stillness. "Temperature drop of 3 degrees in the past 90 seconds, I noted, consulting our equipment. "Barometric pressure remaining consistent, though." "Could be normal cave environment fluctuation," Antonio suggested, though his voice carried unmistakable tension. We began our filming sequence, documenting the chamber from various angles, while I provided narration about the geological formation process and historical significance. Approximately 20 minutes into filming, Antonio suddenly froze mid-adjustment of his camera. "Listen," he whispered, his expression transforming from concentration to alarm. I paused, straining to detect whatever had disturbed him. Initially, I perceived nothing beyond our breathing and the subtle electronic hum of our equipment. Then I heard it, a faint rhythmic sound emanating from the passage we had traversed to reach this chamber. The sound defied immediate categorization. It resembled footsteps but possessed an unusual cadence, alternating between rapid succession and measured intervals, as though whatever produced them shifted between walking and running. More disturbing was the directional quality. The sounds approached our position, then receded, then approached again, as though something paced indecisively at the passage entrance. "Is someone else here?" Antonio whispered, his camera temporarily forgotten. I shook my head, uncertain how to respond. The documented hiking patterns for Hargrove Forest indicated minimal visitation, particularly during weekdays. The probability of encountering other hikers in this specific location seemed extraordinarily low. The footstep sounds continued their erratic pattern, approaching, retreating, approaching again. We exchanged nervous glances, our documentary objectives temporarily forgotten amid rising apprehension. The rational explanations I had confidently provided throughout the day suddenly seemed insufficient. "We should investigate," I finally suggested, though my instincts screamed otherwise. Antonio nodded reluctantly, and we gathered minimal equipment, a single camera and our headlamps, before proceeding cautiously toward the passage entrance. The footsteps continued their irregular pattern, now seemingly stationary at the junction between our chamber and the connecting passage. As we approached the narrowed entrance to our chamber, the sounds abruptly ceased. We paused, listening intently in the sudden silence. Nothing disturbed the stillness for several long moments. Then, without warning, the footsteps resumed, no longer approaching or retreating but circling our position, seemingly emanating from all surrounding passages simultaneously. "That's impossible," Antonio whispered, his voice barely audible. "The acoustics can't—" His statement remained unfinished as a new sound emerged, a soft, deliberate scraping along the stone walls, like fingernails dragging across the mineral surface. This sound circled our position just as the footsteps had, creating the impression of movement along the chamber walls. My scientific certainties evaporated as primal fear overwhelmed rational thought. Without verbalized agreement, Antonio and I began gathering our equipment with frantic urgency, abandoning any pretense of completing our planned filming sequence. "We need to leave," I stated unnecessarily, already moving toward the passage. The sound of fingernails against stone intensified as we prepared to depart, transitioning from rhythmic scraping to increasingly urgent scratching. The acoustic properties of the chamber amplified and distorted these sounds, creating an immersive experience of being surrounded by multiple entities attempting to breach the stone barriers. We abandoned non-essential equipment, prioritizing our cameras and recording devices, and entered the narrow passage leading back to the entrance chamber. The confined space heightened our vulnerability, forcing us to proceed in single file while the unsettling sounds continued behind us. The passage seemed longer during our retreat than it had during our entrance, each step measuring inadequate progress toward safety. Our headlamps cast wildly swinging illumination as we moved, transforming the passage walls into a nauseating blur of shifting shadows and mineral formations. When we finally emerged into the entrance chamber, the relative openness provided momentary relief until we noticed the changed quality of light. The exterior forest had transitioned to complete darkness during our time within the deeper chamber. The cave entrance now framed absolute blackness rather than the twilight we had left behind. "Check the time," I gasped, suddenly disoriented. Antonio consulted his watch with visible confusion. "That's impossible. We've been inside for nearly 3 hours." Our perception suggested we had spent perhaps 40 minutes in the deeper chamber, yet according to our devices, significantly more time had elapsed. This temporal discrepancy added another layer of wrongness to our already disturbed experience. As we hesitated at the boundary between cave and forest, contemplating the darkness beyond, another sound emerged from behind us. Distinct footsteps approaching rapidly from the passage we had just traveled. No longer erratic or pacing, these footsteps communicated purposeful pursuit. We abandoned all remaining pretense of scientific investigation and rushed toward the cave entrance, our headlamps providing minimal illumination against the encompassing forest darkness. The air temperature dropped dramatically as we crossed the threshold from subterranean space to woodland, our exhaled breath immediately visible in the cold night air. The forest at night bore little resemblance to the woodland we had documented during daylight hours. Our headlamps created narrow corridors of visibility, while the surrounding darkness seemed to compress around these artificial boundaries. The absence of ambient sound, no insects, no rustling vegetation, no distant animal calls, created an acoustic vacuum that emphasized our labored breathing and panicked movements. "Which direction is the trail?" Antonio gasped, swinging his headlamp in disoriented arcs. I consulted our GPS device, relieved to find it still functioning. "Northeast from here, about 50 yards to intersect the main path." We oriented ourselves and began moving rapidly toward the trail, abandoning stealth in favor of speed. The terrain proved treacherous in darkness, exposed roots, uneven ground, and low-hanging branches creating constant hazards. Our progress became a series of stumbling advances and near falls, each impediment increasing our growing panic. Approximately 30 yards from our starting position, I risked a backward glance. My headlamp illuminated the cave entrance, a darker void within the general forest darkness. Nothing emerged from that opening, yet the certainty of pursuit remained undiminished. "I think we're clear," I managed between labored breaths. As though summoned by my premature relief, movement registered at the periphery of my vision, not from the cave entrance, but from the surrounding forest. I directed my headlamp toward this disturbance, and momentarily glimpsed what appeared to be a human silhouette moving parallel to our position, approximately 20 yards to our right. "Antonio!" I hissed, gesturing toward the movement. He directed his light toward the indicated location, but illuminated only empty forest. I don't see... His statement terminated as additional movement appeared to our left. Another dark figure moving with uncanny smoothness through the dense undergrowth, maintaining precise distance from our position. "There's someone else out here," Antonio whispered, his voice constricted with fear. We increased our pace, abandoning any pretense of rational assessment. The trail materialized ahead, a slightly clearer path through the otherwise dense vegetation. We turned onto this established route and broke into a full run, our equipment bouncing painfully against our bodies. The trail should have provided easier navigation, yet in our panic, each twist and incline became a potential catastrophe. Antonio stumbled on an exposed root, nearly falling before I grasped his jacket and restored his balance. This momentary delay proved consequential. The pursuing figures drew perceptibly closer during our hesitation. I directed my headlamp backward, finally obtaining clear confirmation of our pursuers. Two dark figures moved swiftly through the trees, their forms partially obscured by shadows despite direct illumination. They appeared human in general outline, but moved with unsettling fluidity, navigating obstacles that would impede normal hikers. "Run!" I shouted, abandoning all restraint. We sprinted along the trail with desperate intensity, our progress hampered by limited visibility and increasing fatigue. The distance between ourselves and our pursuers fluctuated, momentarily increasing when we achieved maximum speed, then diminishing when obstacles forced us to slow. The forest transformed into a nightmare landscape of looming shadows and deceptive perspectives. Tree branches reached like grasping appendages across our path. Root systems emerged unexpectedly beneath our feet. Even the ground itself seemed animated with malicious intent, presenting sudden inclines and depressions precisely where they would most impede our flight. During one relatively straight section of trail, I risked another backward glance and felt paralyzing horror as I processed what I observed. Our pursuers had multiplied, no longer two dark figures, but three distinct silhouettes moving in coordinated pursuit. More terrifying than their number was their movement pattern, no longer maintaining cautious distance but actively closing the gap between us with evident purpose. "They're gaining on us," I gasped, my voice barely functional through exertion and fear. Antonio didn't respond verbally, but his increased pace communicated understanding. We pushed beyond sustainable exertion, drawing on reserves fueled purely by survival instinct. The knowledge that our vehicle, our only realistic escape, waited at the trailhead, provided marginal hope against overwhelming terror. The trail curved sharply rightward, temporarily obscuring our pursuers. We used this momentary advantage to accelerate further, ignoring burning lungs and straining muscles. When the path straightened again, I directed my headlamp backward, expecting to see our pursuers had gained significant ground. Instead, the trail behind us appeared empty. "They're gone," I managed between gasping breaths. Antonio slowed marginally, but maintained an urgent pace. "That's impossible. Where..." Movement registered peripherally, not behind but alongside our position. Our pursuers had abandoned the trail entirely, moving instead through the dense forest parallel to our route. This tactical adjustment suggested intelligence and familiarity with the terrain that transcended normal human capability. "They're flanking us," I realized aloud. We abandoned the trail ourselves, angling directly toward where our vehicle should be located according to GPS. This decision sacrificed established pathways for directional efficiency, a desperate gamble that the shortest route might provide our only survival chance. The forest underbrush clawed at our clothing and equipment as we forced our way through previously undisturbed vegetation. Branches scraped exposed skin, drawing blood that we registered only as additional sensation within an overwhelming flood of sensory input. Our pursuers adjusted to our course change with immediate precision, maintaining parallel tracking that suggested anticipation of our movements rather than reaction. Their coordination became increasingly evident, never crossing paths yet maintaining optimal positioning to prevent potential escape routes. The parking area materialized ahead, our headlamps finally illuminating the gravel clearing where our vehicle waited. Relief surged momentarily before transforming to renewed horror as we realized our tactical disadvantage. To reach the vehicle, we would need to cross approximately 30 yards of open ground, fully exposed to whatever tracked us from the forest perimeter. "We have to make a direct run for it," Antonio gasped, correctly assessing our limited options. "On 3, I agreed. withdrawing the vehicle keys from my pocket. 1, 2, 3. We burst from the forest edge, abandoning stealth entirely in favor of maximum speed across the exposed clearing. Our headlamps created bobbing illumination that transformed the gravel surface into a disorienting landscape of shifting shadows. The vehicle seemed impossibly distant despite objectively close proximity. I risked a backward glance as we crossed the halfway point and observed our pursuers emerging from the tree line. 3 distinct figures now clearly visible against the forest backdrop. Their movements remained uncannily fluid, yet in the relative openness of the parking area, they appeared unmistakably human rather than supernatural entities. This realization provided minimal comfort as they rapidly closed the distance between us. Their speed across open ground exceeded even our adrenaline-fueled pace. The nearest pursuer, taller than the others with distinctively broad shoulders, would intercept us before we reached the vehicle unless something changed immediately. "Split up!" I shouted, veering sharply rightward while Antonio continued directly toward the vehicle. This improvised tactic achieved partial success. 2 pursuers adjusted course to follow me, while the third maintained focus on Antonio. This division improved his chances of reaching the vehicle while placing me in substantially greater danger, a trade-off I accepted without conscious deliberation. I circled toward the forest edge, intending to re-enter the woodland where their advantage seemed less pronounced. Before reaching the tree line, I altered course again, angling back toward the vehicle from a different approach vector. This erratic movement pattern temporarily confused my pursuers, creating a marginal lead that might prove sufficient. Antonio reached the vehicle several seconds before me, fumbling with the passenger door as I tossed him the keys. "Start the engine," I shouted, still 20 yards from safety. The vehicle's headlights blazed to life, illuminating the clearing with sudden brightness that revealed our pursuers with disturbing clarity. 3 individuals dressed entirely in black, their faces obscured by featureless masks that reflected the headlights with unnatural intensity. Their movements remained coordinated despite separation, maintaining optimal pursuit angles despite my evasive pattern. I reached the vehicle moments before the nearest pursuer would have intercepted me, yanking the driver's door open and throwing myself inside. Antonio slammed his door simultaneously, and I frantically engaged the central locking system as dark figures converged on our position. The nearest pursuer, the broad-shouldered individual, reached my window as the locks engaged. A gloved hand slammed against the glass with surprising force, producing a sound like a gunshot within the vehicle interior. Antonio and I recoiled instinctively, momentarily paralyzed by proximity to what had pursued us through darkness. "Drive!" Antonio screamed, breaking my temporary immobility. I turned the ignition key with shaking hands, relief flooding through me as the engine roared to life. That relief evaporated instantly as warning lights illuminated across the dashboard, the tire pressure monitoring system indicating multiple failures simultaneously. "The tires," Antonio whispered, comprehension and horror mingling in his expression. I shifted into reverse despite this warning, intending to attempt escape regardless of vehicle condition. The car lurched backward awkwardly, the steering immediately compromised by deflated tires. After traveling approximately 10 feet, the vehicle became effectively immobilized, settling onto wheel rims that scraped ineffectually against the gravel surface. The realization of our situation descended with paralyzing clarity. We were effectively immobilized in a disabled vehicle, surrounded by individuals who had pursued us with evident malicious intent. The surrounding forest, already established as isolating under normal circumstances, now represented an impenetrable barrier between ourselves and potential assistance. Our pursuers maintained positions surrounding the vehicle, their dark forms clearly visible through windows and headlight illumination. The broad-shouldered figure positioned himself directly before the car, seemingly unconcerned about potential vehicular escape despite standing in our direct path. The 2 smaller figures circled to opposite sides, maintaining equidistant spacing with unsettling precision. "Check your phone," I instructed Antonio, my voice barely functional through constricted throat muscles. He withdrew his device with trembling hands. "No signal. GPS is still active, but no cellular connection." I checked my own phone with identical results. We retained positioning capability but no communication functionality. Useful for eventual location of our remains, but useless for preventing their creation. The broad-shouldered figure approached the front of the vehicle with deliberate slowness, stopping directly before the headlights. With theatrical deliberation, he raised both hands to his face and removed the mask that had concealed his features. The revealed face defied immediate expectation, not monstrous or deformed, but distinctly human, male, approximately 40 years old, with unkempt beard and weathered complexion. Most distinctive were elaborate tattoos extending from his temples down his neck, intricate rose designs with twining stems that disappeared beneath his clothing collar. "What does he want?" Antonio whispered, instinctively shrinking away from the windshield despite our locked doors. The man smiled, a gesture somehow more terrifying than any threatening expression would have been. The pleasure evident in his features transmitted clear malevolence despite the superficially benign expression. He maintained eye contact with me specifically, his gaze communicating recognition, though I was certain we had never previously encountered each other. The smaller figures remained masked as they positioned themselves beside driver and passenger windows. The one nearest my position, noticeably smaller in stature than the others, placed both hands against the glass and leaned forward until their masked face nearly touched the window surface. Through that close proximity, I observed decorative elements I had previously missed. Glittering nail polish on the fingers pressed against my window, suggesting female identity beneath the concealing clothing. "They're going to break in," I stated, abandoning any pretense of optimism. Antonio frantically attempted to restart our emergency communication efforts, redailing emergency services despite consecutive failed attempts. "We need to do something," he repeated between dialing attempts. "We can't just wait for them to—" His statement remained unfinished as the broad-shouldered man abruptly moved from the front of the vehicle to join his companion at Antonio's window. Without warning or apparent effort, he slammed a closed fist against the passenger window with sufficient force to create a spiderweb of cracks across the safety glass. The sound reverberated through the vehicle interior with devastating psychological impact. The tangible evidence that our protective barrier could be breached transformed theoretical danger into immediate physical threat. Our pursuers were neither supernatural entities nor hallucinations. They were corporeal humans with evident capability and intent to harm us. The broad-shouldered man delivered a second impact to the already damaged window. The glass fracture pattern expanded, small fragments detaching from the matrix while the overall structure maintained integrity. A third impact would likely breach the window entirely. "Try again," I instructed Antonio regarding emergency services while frantically searching the vehicle interior for potential defensive implements. The glove compartment contained only vehicle documentation and basic maintenance supplies, nothing that could function as effective weaponry against 3 determined attackers. The smaller figure at my window began methodically testing different sections of glass with fingertips, apparently seeking structural vulnerabilities. The precision of this examination suggested experience with vehicular break-ins, a disconcertingly professional approach to our situation. Antonio's phone suddenly emitted the distinctive sound of a connecting call. His expression transformed from despair to desperate hope as he activated the speaker function. "Hello? Please help us. We're being attacked in Hargrove Forest parking area." The connection quality was poor, staticky, and intermittent, but an official-sounding voice responded with standard emergency protocols, requesting specific location details and situation assessment. Antonio provided information with frantic urgency, while I maintained visual monitoring of our attackers. The broad-shouldered man tilted his head upon hearing the emergency call, his expression changing from sadistic pleasure to pragmatic assessment. He exchanged glances with his companions before stepping back from the vehicle slightly, not retreating but readjusting tactical approach in response to this development. "How long for response?" I shouted toward Antonio's phone, needing this critical information. The emergency operator's response was partially lost to static interference, but the time frame, approximately 20 minutes, emerged with sufficient clarity to register as effectively useless. Our vehicle windows would withstand perhaps another minute of determined assault before breaching. As though confirming this assessment, all 3 attackers simultaneously resumed their positions directly against the vehicle. The broad-shouldered man delivered another powerful impact to Antonio's window, expanding the fracture pattern significantly. His female companion maintained methodical testing of my window, while the third figure moved to the rear of the vehicle, disappearing from direct view. The emergency call disconnected abruptly. Whether due to signal failure or deliberate termination by our attackers remained unclear. Antonio attempted immediate reconnection without success. Our communication avenue had closed as suddenly as it had opened. "They're going to get in before help arrives," I stated unnecessarily, voicing the obvious to process our deteriorating situation. Antonio nodded, his expression transitioning from panic to grim resignation. "We need a weapon." We conducted another frantic search of the vehicle interior, knowing the futility even as we performed the actions. The most substantial items available were a tire pressure gauge and mechanical pencil, objects that might inflict minor injury but would provide no meaningful defense against determined attackers. The broad-shouldered man delivered another impact to Antonio's window, producing a distinctive sound that indicated imminent structural failure. Small fragments detached from the internal surface, falling into the vehicle interior like crystalline precipitation. The female attacker at my window abandoned her methodical assessment in favor of direct force, striking the glass with some implement that produced sharp, focused impacts. A sudden brightness illuminated the parking area, headlights approaching along the access road, accompanied by the distinctive sound of an engine. Our attackers froze momentarily, their coordinated assault interrupted by this unexpected development. The broad-shouldered man turned toward the approaching vehicle, maintaining his position beside our car while clearly assessing this new variable. The approaching vehicle gradually materialized from darkness, a Forest Service truck with official markings clearly visible on its doors. It approached steadily, headlights illuminating the entire parking area and our desperate situation. Our attackers exchanged glances before the broad-shouldered man gestured sharply with one hand. Without hesitation, all three figures abandoned their positions and sprinted toward the forest edge, disappearing into darkness with the same uncanny speed they had demonstrated during pursuit. The Forest Service truck pulled alongside our vehicle, its headlights providing welcome illumination against surrounding darkness. A uniformed ranger emerged cautiously, hand positioned near what appeared to be a service weapon at his belt. "Are you folks all right?" he called, approaching our vehicle with evident concern. Relief overwhelmed coherent response temporarily. I managed to unlock and open my door despite trembling hands that barely maintained sufficient dexterity for the simple action. "They tried to attack us," I explained breathlessly as the ranger reached our position. "Who did?" he asked, scanning the surrounding area with professional vigilance. "3 people in masks," Antonio elaborated, exiting through his damaged window side. "They chased us through the forest and then damaged our car." The ranger radioed for backup immediately, providing concise situation details and our location coordinates. He then escorted us to his vehicle, establishing a defensive perimeter while awaiting additional support. "This isn't the first incident we've had recently," he explained once we were secured in his truck. "There's been reports of harassment and vandalism over the past few months. We've increased patrols but haven't managed to apprehend anyone yet." This information provided contextual framework for our experience, but minimal comfort regarding its terrifying immediacy. The ranger maintained vigilant observation of our surroundings, while additional enforcement personnel responded to his call. Local police arrived approximately 15 minutes after the ranger's initial contact, 3 patrol vehicles with emergency lights illuminating the entire parking area in rhythmic blue and red flashes. Officers secured the perimeter, while medical personnel evaluated our physical condition. Beyond superficial scratches and abrasions sustained during our forest flight, we had escaped serious physical injury. Antonio and I provided detailed statements to investigating officers, describing everything from our documentary project through the cave experiences to the subsequent pursuit and vehicle attack. The officers recorded our accounts professionally, but with evident skepticism regarding certain elements, particularly our descriptions of the pursuers' movement patterns and coordination. "And you saw no identifying features beyond the rose tattoos on the one individual?" a detective asked while reviewing my statement. "Nothing definitive," I confirmed. "The other 2 remained masked throughout the encounter." The detective nodded thoughtfully. "The tattoo description matches a suspect in several similar incidents. Jackson Mercer, local resident with multiple prior arrests for trespassing, harassment, and stalking. Recently released from county detention after serving 14 months. This information provided partial explanation for our experience, confirmation that our pursuers were human malefactors rather than supernatural entities. Yet questions remained regarding their motivation and the specific targeting of our documentary project. "Do you think they were watching us all day?" Antonio asked, voicing the disturbing possibility we both considered. Highly probable, the detective confirmed. Mercer and his associates have established patterns of observing potential victims before engagement. They typically select isolated individuals they can intimidate without witnesses. But why? I pressed, needing comprehension beyond mere identification. What do they gain from this? The detective's expression reflected professional detachment mingled with personal distaste. Based on previous interrogations and psychological evaluations, Mercer derives satisfaction from creating fear. He's described the experience as collecting emotions from his victims. This explanation somehow increased the horror of our experience rather than diminishing it. The concept that our terror had been deliberately cultivated for another's pleasure represented violation beyond physical assault. Police technicians examined our vehicle, documenting the damage while searching for potential evidence. The tires had been systematically slashed, not haphazardly punctured, but deliberately cut along sidewalls to ensure maximum damage. This methodical approach suggested premeditation and experience rather than opportunistic vandalism. "We'll need to impound your vehicle for further processing," an evidence technician explained. "Standard procedure for cases involving physical evidence collection." We agreed without hesitation, arranging alternative transportation through the police department's victim services coordinator. Our immediate concern transcended property considerations, focusing instead on understanding what had occurred and preventing potential recurrence. The investigation continued throughout that night and subsequent days. Police officers accompanied us back to the forest the following morning to recover our abandoned equipment from the cave location. We approached that site with profound reluctance despite daylight conditions and armed escorts. The cave appeared mundane in morning light, merely a geological formation without the oppressive atmosphere we had experienced previously. Our equipment remained exactly where we had abandoned it, undisturbed by either human intervention or wildlife investigation. The officers documented the location thoroughly, collecting additional evidence while we retrieved our possessions. "There's indication of recent activity here," one officer observed, indicating disturbances in the cave floor sediment. "Multiple individuals moving through this area within the past 24 hours. This confirmation of human presence provided rational framework for our experiences but minimal comfort regarding their psychological impact. The knowledge that living humans had orchestrated our terror proved simultaneously reassuring and disturbing, establishing explicable causality while confirming deliberate malevolence. 3 days after the incident, police arrested Jackson Mercer, the broad-shouldered man with distinctive rose tattoos, during a systematic search operation throughout Hargrove Forest. His companions remained unidentified and at large despite extensive investigation efforts. Mercer refused cooperation with authorities, maintaining silence during formal questioning beyond a single disturbing statement. "I do this because I can," he reportedly told investigators during initial processing, "and because I want to." This explanation, devoid of complex motivation or mitigating circumstances, represented terrifying simplicity. Evil without justification beyond personal gratification. The randomness of our selection as targets perhaps constituted the most disturbing aspect of the entire experience. The university granted Antonio and me academic accommodations following the incident, extending project deadlines and providing counseling resources for trauma processing. Professor Weber expressed profound concern upon learning what had transpired during our documentary filming. "The academic pursuit never justifies personal endangerment," he emphasized during our debriefing meeting. "I would have preferred an incomplete project to your experiencing such trauma." Despite his concerns, we decided to complete the documentary with substantial modifications to our original concept. Rather than debunking supernatural explanations for Hargrove Forest's reputation, we focused on examining how genuine human malevolence often underlies supposedly paranormal incidents. Our documentary incorporated police interview footage, with appropriate permissions and redactions, expert commentary from criminology professors, and historical analysis of similar incidents throughout the region. The project evolved from skeptical debunking to nuanced examination of how legitimate dangers become codified as supernatural legends. "People create monsters to process genuine threats," I narrated in our documentary conclusion. "The human mind converts random malevolence into supernatural frameworks because pattern and purpose, even malicious purpose, prove less terrifying than genuine randomness." The completed project received academic recognition and subsequently gained wider distribution through regional documentary festivals. Our experience transformed from isolated traumatic incident to educational resource, providing cautionary perspective regarding wilderness exploration and investigative journalism safety protocols. 3 months after the incident, authorities apprehended one of Mercer's companions following an unrelated domestic disturbance. Kylie Westbrook, identified as the smaller pursuer with distinctive nail polish, provided limited cooperation with investigators in exchange for reduced charges. Her testimony confirmed several disturbing aspects of our experience while contextualizing others. According to Westbrook, Mercer and his associates regularly monitored Hargrove Forest for potential victims, typically selecting individuals they perceived as vulnerable or isolated. They utilized extensive knowledge of the forest terrain to coordinate harassment activities, communicating via encrypted radio devices while maintaining visual contact with targets. Jackson called it harvesting fear, Westbrook stated in her deposition. He believed intense emotional states created energy he could somehow absorb or collect. The rest of us just enjoyed the power trip of controlling other people's emotions. This explanation combined delusional thinking with sadistic pleasure, a disturbing synthesis that explained both the methodical nature of their actions and their apparent satisfaction in our terror. The third accomplice remained unidentified despite ongoing investigation efforts, potentially continuing similar activities without apprehension. Forest authorities implemented enhanced security measures following multiple documented incidents, including increased ranger patrols, surveillance camera installation at trailheads, and improved cellular communication infrastructure. These practical interventions addressed physical safety concerns, while psychological impacts proved less amenable to systematic resolution. I continue experiencing periodic nightmares featuring pursuit through endless forest corridors, dreams where rational explanation dissolves into primal terror despite conscious recognition of their unreality. Antonio reports similar psychological aftereffects, particularly regarding cave environments and confined spaces. We maintain regular contact with investigating officers, receiving updates regarding case developments and security implementations. Jackson Mercer received a substantial prison sentence for multiple convictions including assault, criminal threatening, and property destruction. Psychological evaluations diagnosed several personality disorders characterized by sadistic tendencies and diminished empathy. Our documentary project, now titled Human Monsters: The Psychology of Manufactured Fear, continues circulation through academic and public education channels. We regularly receive correspondence from individuals describing similar experiences throughout various wilderness areas, suggesting patterns of predatory behavior extending beyond our isolated incident. The university established enhanced safety protocols for field research projects, requiring comprehensive risk assessments and communication plans for all off-campus activities. Our experience became incorporated into journalism and documentary filming curricula as cautionary case study regarding investigative boundaries and appropriate safety measures. I returned to Hargrove Forest once following the incident, accompanied by therapists specializing in exposure-based trauma treatment. The daylight forest appeared ordinary: trees, undergrowth, natural sounds without supernatural overtones. Yet even with professional support and rational understanding, uneasiness persisted throughout the controlled visit. This lasting impact perhaps represents the most significant damage inflicted by Mercer and his companions: the transformation of natural environment into psychological triggering space through deliberate terror cultivation. Their actions permanently altered my perception of woodland settings and isolated locations, imposing hypervigilance that resists rational dismissal. The forest itself remains neither haunted nor cursed in conventional supernatural understanding. The genuine horror lurking within Hargrove originated not from spectral entities or ancient curses, but from human consciousness. Individuals who deliberately cultivated fear for personal gratification. This reality ultimately proves more disturbing than any supernatural explanation could provide. The legends surrounding Hargrove Forest continue circulating despite our documentary efforts and police interventions. Our experience has become incorporated into local folklore, another layer of cautionary mythology warning against forest exploration. The distinction between our documented human encounters and supposed supernatural manifestations blurs in retelling, demonstrating how genuine trauma transforms into mythological framework. I maintain scientific skepticism regarding paranormal phenomena while acknowledging newly discovered respect for instinctual responses to environmental warning signs. The forest knew something was wrong that day, not through supernatural awareness, but through subtle disruptions to normal patterns that registered subconsciously before achieving conscious recognition. Our documentary project succeeded in documenting horror, though not the variety we initially anticipated. We captured evidence not of supernatural entities, but of humanity's capacity for calculated cruelty. Individuals who derive pleasure from manipulating others' emotional states through systematic terrorization. This knowledge provides coherent explanation without comforting resolution. Understanding the mechanisms behind our experience offers intellectual framework while emotional processing remains ongoing and incomplete. Some traumas resist neat conclusion despite comprehensive analysis. God alone knows how many similar predators operate undetected throughout isolated regions, deliberately cultivating fear while their actions become attributed to supernatural forces. This possibility represents the most disturbing aspect of our experience, the recognition that human monsters move among us, their deliberate malevolence misattributed to paranormal entities. The forest itself remains merely a forest. Trees, undergrowth, geological formations without inherent malice. The true horror existed within human consciousness. Individuals who selected random victims for systematic terrorization, based solely on opportunity and personal gratification. This reality ultimately proves more disturbing than any supernatural explanation. Ghosts and demons, if they existed, might operate according to comprehensible rules and limitations. Human predators who derive pleasure from others' fear follow no predictable patterns beyond opportunity and impulse, making them simultaneously more explicable and more terrifying than any paranormal entity could ever be. The wilderness was supposed to heal me. That's what everyone says, right? Get away from it all. Reconnect with nature. Find yourself in the solitude. 3 months after my divorce finalized, I packed my Subaru with camping gear I hadn't touched in years and headed to the Cascades, chasing some vague notion of catharsis. I chose the most remote trailhead I could find on the map, one that required navigating unmarked Forest Service roads for the final 17 miles. The ranger at the station raised her eyebrows when I mentioned my destination. Blackwater Ridge? That's pretty isolated, she said, studying my city-soft appearance. Not many folks head out there these days. That's the appeal, I replied, signing the backcountry permit. How's the trail condition? She hesitated. Officially, open. Realistically, hasn't been maintained in years. We're understaffed. She pushed the permit across the counter. Make sure someone knows where you are and when you're coming back. I nodded, though there wasn't really anyone left to tell. My ex had taken our friends in the separation. My parents had moved to Arizona, and my coworkers would hardly notice my absence during a 2-week vacation. The drive to the trailhead took longer than expected. By the time I parked, afternoon shadows were lengthening across the small clearing that marked the trail entrance. A weathered wooden sign, its paint mostly flaked away, displayed a crude map of the area. I shouldered my pack and set off. The first few miles felt good, physically demanding but mentally soothing. The forest was dense here, old-growth pines and cedars creating a separate world beneath their canopy. Shafts of golden light pierced through gaps in the foliage, illuminating swirling motes of dust and pollen. The only sounds were my boots on the soft earth, my breathing, and the occasional calling of birds I couldn't identify. I'd planned to reach Jackson Lake by nightfall, but the overgrown trail slowed my progress considerably. As dusk settled, I realized I needed to make camp sooner than intended. I veered off trail toward a small clearing I'd spotted through the trees. The snap of a branch stopped me cold. It came from somewhere to my left, deeper in the woods. Not the light crack of a squirrel or rabbit, but the substantial sound of weight pressing down on deadwood. I peered into the gathering darkness between the trees, but saw nothing unusual. "Hello?" I called, immediately regretting breaking the silence. No response came, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I hurried to the clearing and set up my tent with practiced efficiency, though my hands trembled slightly. I told myself it was just fatigue. After a quick meal of dehydrated stroganoff, I crawled into my sleeping bag. The forest had grown unnervingly quiet. No insects chirping, no night birds calling, just the occasional whisper of wind through the canopy high above. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of being followed. I jolted awake sometime in the dead of night, heart racing. Something had woken me, a sound just outside my tent. I held my breath, straining to hear. Thump, thump, thump. Heavy footfalls circled my campsite, methodical and unhurried. Not a deer or elk, the rhythm was wrong, the stride too long. Each step was deliberate, pressing into the earth with purpose. I fumbled for my flashlight but froze when a shadow passed across the tent wall, massive and bipedal. The footsteps stopped directly outside the thin nylon barrier. I could hear breathing now, deep and rumbling, like nothing I'd ever heard before. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as I lay paralyzed, scarcely daring to breathe. Eventually, the footsteps resumed, growing fainter as whatever it was moved away. Dawn found me still wide-eyed and trembling. I broke camp in record time and abandoned my planned route, instead striking out in what I hoped was the direction of an old fire service road marked on my map. If I could reach it by nightfall, I might be able to follow it back to civilization. The day grew hot and humid as I pushed through increasingly dense undergrowth. The trail had disappeared entirely now, forcing me to navigate by compass. By mid-afternoon, exhaustion and dehydration were taking their toll. That's when I spotted it through the trees, the unmistakable right angles of human construction. Not the fire road I'd been seeking, but something else entirely. A cabin, weathered and listing slightly, stood in a small clearing ahead. Relief flooded through me. Shelter, maybe water, perhaps even a radio or some means of communication. I approached cautiously, calling out, but received no answer. The cabin appeared long abandoned, its windows clouded with grime, its wooden steps sagging. As I reached for the door handle, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Pressed into the soft earth around the cabin were dozens of enormous, bare footprints, each nearly twice the size of my own. The door creaked open with reluctant protest. I hesitated on the threshold, every instinct screaming for caution. But the alternative was another night in the tent with whatever had stalked my campsite. At least the cabin offered solid walls. "Hello?" I called again, my voice sounding small in the stillness. The interior was dim, with dust motes dancing in the thin beams of light filtering through filthy windows. The cabin consisted of one main room with a small kitchenette in one corner and a door that presumably led to a bathroom. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, and rustic furniture, a sagging couch, a wooden table with 2 chairs, filled the space. What caught my attention immediately were the walls. Every inch was covered with papers, newspaper clippings, hand-drawn maps, photographs, and pages filled with cramped handwriting. Red string connected certain items, creating a chaotic web that encircled the room. I approached one of the newspaper clippings dated 1978. Search continues for missing hikers, 3rd disappearance this season. Another, from 1993, park rangers find abandoned campsite. Family of 4 vanishes without trace. My eyes moved to a photograph, grainy and overexposed, showing what appeared to be a tall, dark figure standing between distant trees. The image was blurry, but something about the proportions seemed wrong. Too tall, too broad. The handwritten pages contained frantic observations. Day 37. Heard it again last night, moving around the cabin, testing the doors. The sounds it makes aren't animal or human, something in between. Day 42. Found another tree structure today, 20 feet high at least. Branches woven together too precisely to be natural. Similar to the others, but larger. They're getting closer to the cabin. Day 49. It left something on the porch, a deer carcass. Not killed by normal predators. Limbs twisted off. Message clear. This could be me. I swallowed hard, mouth suddenly dry. A research station, perhaps. Some wildlife biologist's field notes. The alternative was too disturbing to consider. The light was fading outside as I continued exploring. In the kitchenette, I found canned goods that hadn't expired yet, suggesting the cabin hadn't been abandoned for long. The small bathroom contained a shower that, to my surprise, produced cold but clean water when I turned the handle. A generator hummed somewhere outside, still operational. Relief mingled with growing unease. The cabin offered shelter and supplies, but its former occupant's obsession was deeply unsettling. Had they been documenting something real? Or was this the product of isolation-induced paranoia? As darkness fell, I struggled with my decision. Staying meant possible safety, but also meant I was surrounded by evidence of something stalking these woods. Leaving meant facing the night without protection. I opted to stay, securing the door with its heavy wooden bar and checking the windows. All were intact, though none had locks. I lit the oil lamps I'd found and heated one of the canned stews on the small propane stove. While eating, I continued examining the documentation on the walls. One section was dedicated to historical accounts, newspaper stories dating back to the 1800s describing wild men of the woods and forest devils, Native American legends of stick Indians and other forest spirits, loggers' tales of mysterious screams in the night and massive humanoid footprints found around their camps. Another section contained more recent reports: missing hikers, strange animal killings, unexplained sounds recorded by forestry workers, and dozens of plaster casts of footprints, each measuring over 15 inches in length with unique dermal ridge patterns meticulously noted. The most disturbing section was the map. It covered the largest wall, showing the surrounding wilderness with hundreds of pins marking locations: red for disappearances, blue for sightings, yellow for structures, whatever those were, green for footprints. The pins clustered densely around the cabin's location. Below the map, a journal entry read, "They don't attack randomly. They're territorial and intelligent. They watch first, learn patterns. They can mimic voices, lure you out. Don't trust what you hear outside. Don't leave after dark." Night had fully descended now. The forest outside had gone silent again, that same unsettling absence of natural sounds I'd noticed at my campsite. I extinguished all but one lamp and sat on the couch, my back to the wall, watching the windows and door. That's when I heard it. A heavy footfall on the porch outside. Then another. The old boards creaked under significant weight. Something scraped against the exterior wall as if testing its strength. I held my breath, heart hammering against my ribs. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, methodically, pausing at each window. A shadow passed across the glass, enormous and distinctly bipedal. Then came the sound that would haunt my dreams forever after. A low, rumbling vocalization that started as something akin to a growl, but modulated into something else entirely. Something that raised the hair on my neck and sent ice through my veins. It was trying to speak. The vocalization outside morphed from guttural rumbles to something more structured. Not quite words, but unmistakably an attempt at communication. The cadence reminded me of questions, rising inflections at the end of each utterance. I remained frozen on the couch, afraid that any movement might provoke whatever stalked outside. The windows rattled as something pressed against them, testing their strength. Shadow-obscured eyes peered in, searching. When it reached the front window, our gazes met. I'd expected animal eyes, perhaps the reflected amber glow of a bear or cougar. What I saw instead were unmistakably human-like eyes, dark and intelligent, set in a face partially obscured by the window's grime and the darkness beyond. They widened slightly upon seeing me, and the creature retreated from view. The footsteps returned to the door. The heavy wooden bar across it shuddered as something pushed from outside. Then came 3 distinct knocks, deliberate, controlled, intelligent. My mind raced through the implications. This wasn't random animal behavior. This was purposeful. The creature knew what doors were for. It was requesting entry. "I'm not opening the door," I called out, voice cracking. The knocking stopped. For several long moments, nothing happened. Then came a sound from directly above, heavy movement across the cabin's roof. Something large was climbing on top of the structure. I scanned the ceiling in panic, looking for potential entry points. The stone chimney was the obvious concern, but its narrow flue would prevent anything larger than a raccoon from entering. Still, I moved to the fireplace, ready to fend off any attempt. A scratching sound from above shifted to the rear of the cabin. I heard a metallic groan, followed by a crash. The generator outside sputtered and died, plunging the cabin into darkness save for my single oil lamp. "Shit," I whispered, fumbling for my backpack where I kept a flashlight. The darkness outside now matched the darkness within, neutralizing whatever advantage the cabin's walls had provided. I could no longer see if something was peering in, could no longer track the creature's movements. I retreated to the corner farthest from windows and doors, lamp in one hand, hunting knife in the other. The knife was meant for field dressing game, not self-defense. But it was all I had. Hours passed in tense silence. Occasionally I heard movement outside, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but always at a distance, as if the creature was patrolling the perimeter. The methodical nature of the sounds suggested intelligence and patience. Around 3 a.m., a new sound emerged from the forest, a long, mournful call that began as a deep bellow before rising to a wailing pitch that raised goosebumps along my arms. The sound echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. Minutes later, an answering call came from the opposite direction. Then another, more distant still. There were more of them out there. The realization hit me with nauseating force. I wasn't dealing with a lone predator or territorial animal. This was communication between multiple individuals. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. As the first gray light filtered through the windows, the sounds outside retreated. By full daylight, the forest had returned to normal. Birds singing, insects buzzing, as if the night's events had been merely a nightmare. I used the respite to thoroughly explore the cabin, searching for anything that might help me understand what I was facing or aid in my survival. In a trunk beneath the bed, I found the jackpot, the missing researcher's field journal. The entries began professionally enough, documenting a self-funded research expedition to study reported Sasquatch activity in the region. The writer, Dr. Alan Marshall, according to the journal's inside cover, had been a zoologist specializing in primate behavior before dedicating himself to cryptozoology. His early entries were systematic and skeptical, evaluating purported evidence, setting camera traps, collecting environmental samples. But around 2 months in, the tone shifted dramatically. March 12th, first direct observation today. Subject approximately 8, 9 feet tall, bipedal, covered in dark reddish-brown hair. Not a bear on hind legs, as skeptics claim. Movement unmistakably hominid. Observed for 7 minutes before it detected my presence. Did not flee immediately. Instead maintained eye contact for 30 seconds before retreating. Intelligence evident. March 20th. They're aware of me now. Found all my camera traps disassembled. Not destroyed, but carefully taken apart and components arranged in piles. Message clear. We know what you're doing. April 3rd. Communication attempt today. Subject approached to within 50 yards, performed series of gestures and vocalizations, attempting to learn basic patterns. They understand mimicry, responded when I repeated vocalizations. The entries continued, documenting increasing contact with what Marshall called the clan, a group of at least 7 individuals with distinct social hierarchy and communication patterns. He'd progressed to rudimentary communication with them through vocalizations and gestures. Then came the disturbing shift. May 17th. They want something from me. Alpha male left forest offerings on porch again, flowering plants arranged in patterns, unusual stones, attempting to decipher meaning. May 25th. I understand now. They're losing territory, logging operation 5 miles west, driving them toward populated areas. They want intervention. How can I explain I have no power to stop it? The final entry dated just 2 weeks ago, June 2nd. They're coming tonight. I've failed to make them understand. The offerings have stopped. Found warning signs instead. Broken saplings pointing toward cabin. Animal remains arranged in patterns. Classic territorial display. I should leave, but my research is too important. Humanity needs to know they exist. I'll try one more communication attempt. If unsuccessful, we'll retreat to Ranger Station tomorrow. The journal ended there. No sign of what happened to Marshall, just an ominous silence. I looked back at the walls, at the years of documentation, at the evidence of something remarkable and terrifying living in these woods. Outside, a branch snapped. Then another. Something was approaching the cabin in broad daylight. I moved to the window, cautiously peering out. There, at the forest's edge, stood what I could only describe as a nightmare made flesh. Standing just within the tree line, partially obscured by foliage, was a figure that defied everything I thought I knew about North American wildlife. It stood upright, bipedal. Its height difficult to gauge at this distance, but clearly massive, at least 8 feet tall. Dark, reddish-brown hair covered its body, longer around the shoulders and shorter on the face, which appeared startlingly flat-featured except for a pronounced brow ridge. Most unsettling were its eyes. Deep-set, dark, and undeniably intelligent. It was watching me watch it, an awareness in its gaze that transcended animal curiosity. This was assessment, calculation, decision-making. I remained frozen at the window, breath fogging the glass. Neither of us moved for what felt like eternity, but was likely only minutes. Finally, the creature deliberately raised one massive hand, palm forward. Not a threatening gesture, but one unmistakably meant to communicate. Then it retreated into the forest, melting between the trees with shocking grace for something so large. Within seconds, it had vanished completely, leaving me to question if I'd actually seen it at all. My hands shook as I returned to Marshall's journal, flipping through the pages with newfound urgency. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. The researcher's notes described a complex social structure among what he called the clan, a group with distinct individuals, hierarchies, and communication patterns. According to Marshall, they weren't the mindless beasts of campfire tales, but intelligent hominids with culture, language, and territorial boundaries. His notes documented observed behaviors. Tree structures used as territorial markers, complex vocalizations with apparent syntactical patterns, gift leaving as communication, and most disturbing, strategic intimidation of humans who ventured too deep into their territory. Marshall believed they deliberately cultivated their mystique, the sightings rare enough to be dismissed as legend, the evidence scant enough to be explained away by skeptics. They were, in his assessment, actively avoiding human documentation. Until something changed. The logging operation Marshall mentioned had apparently pushed them into conflict with humans. They'd sought him out not as prey, but as potential intermediary, a human who might understand them, who might help. And when he couldn't, they'd... what? The journal ended without explanation. Marshall had vanished, leaving everything behind. Had they killed him? Driven him away? Or something else entirely? I spent the rest of the daylight hours preparing for nightfall. I repaired the generator best I could, restored power to the cabin, and took inventory of supplies. There was enough food for perhaps a week if I rationed carefully. The water still worked, drawing from what I assumed was a nearby spring. Most importantly, I formulated a plan. The nearest ranger station was a 2-day hike according to my map, assuming I could find and follow the old fire road. But attempting to leave meant exposing myself in territory they clearly considered their own. The cabin, for all its isolation, offered security and shelter. I decided to wait one more day to observe their patterns and behaviors from safety before attempting to leave. If Marshall's notes were accurate, they were most active at dawn and dusk. My best chance would be to leave midday when they typically retreated deeper into the forest. As evening approached, I secured the cabin, barricading the door and windows as best I could. I positioned myself in the main room with clear sight lines to all potential entry points, Marshall's journal and my knife close at hand. Darkness fell, and with it came the silence. That same unnatural hush that had preceded previous encounters. The forest itself seemed to be holding its breath in anticipation. The first indication they had returned was a subtle vibration, almost imperceptible but growing stronger. Rhythmic impacts on the earth outside, like coordinated footfalls circling the cabin. Not just one set, but many, moving in concert. Then came the vocalizations, complex exchanges between multiple individuals. Some were the deep, rumbling calls I'd heard before, while others were higher-pitched, almost song-like. They were communicating with each other, discussing strategy perhaps. I recalled Marshall's notes. They use sound to disorient and intimidate. Multiple individuals will call from different directions, creating auditory confusion for the target. Classic predator tactic, but executed with disturbing intelligence. The sounds converged on the cabin from all directions. I turned slowly in place, tracking the movement outside. They were coordinating, positioning themselves around the structure. Something scraped against the rear wall, claws or fingers dragging across wood. Another sound at the roof, weight shifting the ancient timbers. A shadow passed across the window to my left, then another to my right. They were testing the perimeter, probing for weaknesses. A sharp crack from the back of the cabin made me jump. I spun toward the sound, knife raised. Something had broken, wood splintering under force. Another crack followed, then a crash as something gave way entirely. Cold night air rushed in from the storage room at the cabin's rear. They had breached the outer wall. I backed toward the front door, weighing impossible options. Stay and face whatever was breaking in, or flee into darkness where others surely waited. Before I could decide, the power failed again. The lights died, plunging me into absolute darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, found it, clicked it on. The beam illuminated the massive figure now standing in the doorway between the main room and the storage area. It stood fully upright, its head nearly touching the ceiling. Broad shoulders filled the frame, powerful arms hanging at its sides. The face was partially shadowed, but I could make out those same intelligent eyes from the forest, now fixed directly on me. It took a step forward, floorboards creaking under its weight. I raised my knife, knowing it was futile. The creature stopped, tilted its head slightly, studying me. Then slowly, deliberately, it extended one massive hand, palm up. In its center lay a small object that gleamed in my flashlight beam. Dr. Marshall's voice recorder. The creature's stance remained non-threatening, powerful arm extended with the voice recorder resting in its massive palm. Its breathing was deep and rhythmic, a rumbling sound that filled the cabin. Those intelligent eyes never left mine, watching, assessing. Every instinct screamed to run, but rationality kept me rooted in place. If it wanted to harm me, it could have done so already. This deliberate approach, this offering, suggested something else entirely. With trembling fingers, I reached for the device, half expecting the creature to lunge. It remained perfectly still as I plucked the recorder from its palm. Only then did it retreat one step, giving me space. A calculated move, showing awareness of human comfort zones, demonstrating intelligence and restraint. I examined the recorder, a standard digital model with a small screen showing several saved audio files. The most recent was dated the day after Marshall's final journal entry. Heart pounding, I pressed play. Marshall's voice emerged, strained and urgent. "If you're hearing this, you've found my cabin. I need you to understand what's happening here. They're not what we thought. Not mindless beasts, not monsters." Background noises interrupted, heavy breathing, rustling movement. The recording continued. "They brought me here to their, I don't know what to call it. Not a village exactly. A gathering place. There are structures, tools, evidence of culture. They're showing me deliberately, wanting me to document." More background noise then. "The logging company moved into the Western Valley 3 months ago. It's driving them from ancestral territory, forcing them closer to human settlements. They need an advocate, someone to speak for them. That's why they've been allowing themselves to be seen more frequently. A desperate measure from a species that's survived by staying hidden." Marshall's voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm recording multiple files explaining what I've learned. Their language, behavior patterns, social structure. Evidence that could prove their existence. They understand what I'm doing. They're cooperating." The recording ended abruptly. I looked up at the creature, still watching me intently from the doorway. Its massive finger pointed toward the recorder again, indicating more files. I played the next one. Territorial boundaries are marked with elaborate stick structures. They communicate location, resources, warnings through these markers. Different designs have different meanings. They're a sophisticated form of writing, essentially. Another file. Social structure is complex. Extended family groups with clear hierarchy. Evidence of knowledge transmission between generations. Tool use observed repeatedly. Not just found objects, but modified implements for specific purposes. File after file detailed Marshall's observations and discoveries. The creatures, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever name humans had given them, were not the mindless beasts of legend, but intelligent hominids with culture, communication, and community. The final recording was different. Marshall's voice was tense, frightened. "They've shown me something disturbing. The logging company isn't just clearing trees. They're developing the land. Plans for a resort complex. It would destroy the clan's core territory, drive them out completely. The clan is divided on how to respond. Some advocate retreat deeper into wilderness. Others suggest more aggressive territorial defense. I'm trying to mediate, to find another solution. If I can get evidence to the environmental authorities." The recording cut off mid-sentence. I looked up at the creature, understanding dawning. "Marshall," I said quietly. "Where is he?" The creature made a series of gestures, pointing deeper into the forest, then making a sweeping motion with its arm. "He left?" I guessed. A slow blink, affirmation. "And you brought me his recordings. You want me to continue his work? Another blink. Why me? The creature tilted its head, studying me. Then it gestured toward the wall covered with Marshall's research, toward the maps showing the territory and the encroaching development. I understood then. It wasn't random that I'd found this cabin. They had been watching me since I entered their territory, had perhaps even herded me here, away from my planned route. I was being recruited. I don't know if I can help, I said honestly. I'm not a scientist. I don't have influence or connections. The creature made a rumbling sound deep in its chest. Not threatening, but insistent. It gestured again to the recorder in my hand. I played through the files again, listening more carefully. Marshall had documented not just observations, but action plans. Contacts in environmental agencies, journalism connections, legal strategies for blocking the development on endangered species grounds. The creature waited patiently as I absorbed the information. When I looked up again, it had moved slightly further into the room. In the improved light, I could see its features more clearly. The heavy brow ridge, the wide nose, the surprisingly expressive face. Female, I realized, noting the proportions and facial structure matching Marshall's descriptions of sexual dimorphism in the species. She was trusting me with her presence, making herself vulnerable by entering this human space. The significance wasn't lost on me. If I agree to help, I said slowly, to take Marshall's research and try to stop the development, would you let me leave safely? She made a gesture. Arm extended toward the door, path cleared. And the others? Your family? They'll let me go too? She made a series of vocalizations. Deep, resonant sounds that carried through the walls of the cabin. Answering calls came from outside, higher and lower pitches responding in kind. Then she stepped aside completely, clearing my path to the door. I gathered Marshall's journal, the recorder, and as much of his research as I could fit in my pack. The creature watched silently as I prepared to leave, her expression unreadable but her eyes never leaving mine. As I reached the door, I hesitated. Do you have a name? Something I can call you? She made a sound, a complex vocalization I couldn't possibly reproduce. I'll call you Silva, I said. From the forest. She blinked slowly again. Acceptance. I unbarred the door and stepped out into the night. The forest beyond was filled with shadows, some of which I now knew were not merely trees. Eyes reflected my flashlight beam from multiple directions, the rest of the clan watching. Silva emerged behind me, standing tall in the doorway. She made a gesture toward the old fire road visible in the moonlight, then pointed southeast. The way out. I nodded my understanding and took my first steps away from the cabin. Marshall's research heavy in my pack and heavier still in my mind. Behind me, Silva called out once more, a sound that seemed to carry a message even though I couldn't understand the language. It felt like a farewell, or perhaps a warning. As I walked the moonlit path, the forest whispered around me. I knew they were following, watching, escorting me to the edge of their territory, guaranteeing my safety in exchange for my promise. I had entered these woods seeking escape from my broken life. I would leave them carrying a burden and purpose I never expected. The truth about what lived in these forests had found me. Now I had to make the world believe. The hike out was surreal. I moved through the dark forest with my flashlight beam illuminating the path ahead, constantly aware of movement in my peripheral vision. They were escorting me, never directly visible, but unmistakably present. Occasionally, branches would snap or foliage would rustle, reminding me of my silent guardians. By dawn, I reached the fire road. The dirt track was overgrown but navigable, clearly leading back toward civilization. As the sun rose higher, the sense of being watched gradually diminished. At some invisible boundary, they had stopped following. I was leaving their territory. The journey back to my car was arduous, but uneventful. My mind raced with everything I'd experienced, everything I'd learned. Marshall's research, secured in my backpack, felt like both treasure and burden. 2 days later, I emerged from the wilderness, haggard and exhausted, but determined. The ranger station appeared deserted when I arrived, but a truck was parked outside. I knocked urgently on the door. A different ranger than the one who'd issued my permit answered, eyebrows rising at my disheveled appearance. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, ushering me inside. Not a ghost, I replied. Something much more real. Over the next few hours, I told her everything. Finding the cabin, discovering Marshall's research, the encounter with Silva and her clan. I showed her the journal, played the recordings, spread out the maps detailing the clan's territory and the planned development. Her skepticism gradually gave way to stunned silence as the evidence mounted. When I finished, she sat back in her chair, running a hand through her hair. Dr. Marshall was well known in certain circles, she said finally. Respected before he went all in on cryptozoology. His disappearance caused some concern, but most assumed he'd simply gone deeper into the backcountry. He did, I said, just not willingly at first. She nodded slowly. Even with these recordings, these notes, it's going to be almost impossible to convince people. You understand that, right? Decades of hoaxes and false claims have poisoned the well. I know, but the development is real. The environmental impact is real. We don't need people to believe in Sasquatch to stop the logging and construction. We just need to use the right legal mechanisms. We? She asked, raising an eyebrow. I made a promise, I said simply. Over the following weeks, that promise consumed me. I worked with the ranger, Karen, to compile Marshall's research into actionable evidence. We focused on the environmental impact angles, documenting the unique ecosystem of the region and identifying several legitimately endangered species whose habitats would be destroyed. We contacted environmental advocacy groups, carefully excluding the more fantastic elements of our discovery. We leaked information about the development plans to local media, stirring community opposition. We filed challenges with regulatory agencies, forcing impact studies that would delay construction. All the while, I kept Marshall's true discoveries close. The recordings, the journal, the evidence of an undocumented intelligent species living in our forests, these remained secure, waiting for the right moment, the right audience. 3 months after my encounter in the woods, I returned to the edge of the territory. Not all the way to the cabin, but to a meadow that Marshall had marked as a neutral ground, a place where contact had occurred before. I came alone against Karen's strenuous objections. I brought news. The development had been temporarily halted pending further environmental review. Our coalition had won the first battle, though the war was far from over. As dusk fell, I waited in the meadow, wondering if anyone would come. Hours passed with nothing but normal forest sounds surrounding me. Perhaps they weren't here anymore. Perhaps they'd moved on when their territory was threatened. Then, just as I was about to leave, I heard it. That distinctive, low vocalization that had haunted my dreams for months. I turned toward the sound. Silva stood at the forest's edge, taller and more imposing than I remembered. She wasn't alone this time. A smaller figure stood beside her, juvenile, watching me with curious eyes. I approached slowly, hands visible, unthreatening. When I reached speaking distance, I stopped. "The development is delayed," I said, knowing she could understand even if she couldn't respond in kind. "We're fighting it, using the legal system, environmental regulations. It's working so far." Silva made a gesture, head tilted, questioning. "I haven't told anyone about you," I assured her. "Not the whole truth, just enough to protect the forest. Your secret is safe." She studied me for a long moment, those intelligent eyes seeming to look through me rather than at me. Then she made a sound, not the complex language she used with her kind, but something simpler, crafted for my benefit. It sounded remarkably like good. The juvenile beside her watched me with undisguised curiosity. Future generations, I realized. I was working to protect their future as much as the present clan. Silva made another gesture, a hand extended toward me, then sweeping back toward the forest. An invitation. I hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Yes," I said. "I want to learn more." As I followed them into the gathering darkness, I reflected on how thoroughly my life had changed. 3 months ago, I'd come to these woods broken and alone, seeking solitude to heal my wounds. Instead, I'd found purpose, connection, a cause greater than myself, and perhaps most incredibly, the truth behind one of humanity's oldest legends. The forest closed around us as we walked, 3 bipedal figures moving through ancient trees. 1 human, 2 not quite, but all sharing this planet, this ecosystem, this moment in time. Behind us, the mists swallowed our footprints, mine narrow and defined, theirs massive and primal. Evidence of our passage would fade, just as it had for centuries. The world wasn't ready for the whole truth yet, but I was. And I would keep my promise to those who had chosen to reveal themselves to me. In the deepening twilight, I followed Silva deeper into her world, leaving mine behind. At least for now. The truth about what lived in these forests had found me, and I had found my purpose in protecting it. Some secrets I'd learned were worth keeping, and some truths changed everything. As night fell completely, the forest came alive with sounds, not the random chaos of wilderness, but the complex communication of an intelligent species that had evaded human documentation for millennia. I listened, and began to learn. My name is Aaron Whitaker, and back in 2017 I took a solo RV trip through the remote parts of the Gila National Forest in New Mexico. Just to get away, you know? I'd been through a brutal breakup, and I was craving a little peace and quiet. I thought some quiet time out there might actually do me some good. Plus, I always liked a bit of adventure, and nothing sounded better than miles of solitude where no one knew my business. It was late afternoon when I finally parked the RV by a rocky clearing near the edge of a small river. The place was gorgeous, quiet, not a soul in sight. Just me, the trees, and a slow-moving stream. I set up camp, got my fold-out chair out, cracked a beer, and sat down, breathing in that fresh mountain air. Just peace and stillness. Perfect. By the time I'd finished my second drink, I noticed the wind picked up, blowing harder than it had before, making the trees sway in that deep, rustling way that always makes you feel just a bit on edge. I brushed it off as a little trick my mind was playing on me. Guess even out here in the woods, my thoughts could still drift back to some of the uglier parts of life. A couple of hours passed. The light started to fade, so I gathered some wood to start a fire. I didn't realize until then just how dark it got out there, with the mountains blocking the horizon. As I lit the fire, a stray thought crossed my mind about how isolated I really was. Out there, it'd take anyone an hour to reach me if anything went wrong. It's funny. That was what I'd come for. But now the thought made me feel uneasy. The forest sounds changed as night fell. I tried convincing myself it was natural, but everything seemed amplified. Branches creaking, leaves rustling, stones occasionally skittering down the nearby slope. I stared into the flames, watching them dance and trying to shake the growing sensation of being watched. My phone had no service here. I'd told my brother where I was headed approximately, but even he didn't expect to hear from me for at least 3 days. 3 days of complete isolation. The thought that had seemed so liberating that morning now felt suffocating. I pulled out my notebook, thinking I'd jot down some thoughts, maybe even sketch the landscape as a distraction. My hand trembled slightly as I wrote. The words looked foreign on the page, like someone else had written them. Something feels wrong here. After warming up by the fire for a while, I heard a soft crunching from somewhere behind me, just out of sight. Probably just some animal curious about the light and the smell of the food, I thought. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. The footsteps weren't the quick, light steps you'd expect from a rabbit or a fox. They were slower, almost deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight, aiming it in the direction of the sound. The beam caught a shape, tall, looming, definitely not a coyote or anything small. My heart thumped as I made out the silhouette of a man, just standing there, half hidden by the trees about 30 feet away. I called out, asking who was there, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer, just stayed in the shadows, watching. Now I've got nothing against people, but I sure wasn't looking for company that night. I stood up and asked him again if he needed help or was lost, but he didn't budge. I could barely make out his features in the dim light, but something about him just didn't sit right with me. His stance was too rigid, too unnatural. "All right, I think it's time for you to head out," I said, mustering as much authority as I could. To my surprise, he took a step forward, revealing his face. Wild, disheveled hair and a look in his eyes that made my skin crawl. He just grinned at me, a wide, chilling grin that seemed more like a snarl than a smile. I could feel my pulse quicken as he moved even closer, his hands clenching and unclenching like he was sizing me up. There wasn't a single friendly bone in this guy. I backed up slowly, trying not to look away, my mind racing for options. The RV was a few yards away, but I didn't want to turn my back on him. I thought of the knife in the kitchen drawer, a flimsy thing, but better than nothing. As if sensing my thoughts, the guy suddenly lunged forward, his grin vanishing, replaced with a dead-eyed focus. I bolted, sprinting for the RV. I slammed the door shut, locking it just as he threw himself against it, pounding with such force that the whole vehicle shook. My hands shook as I fumbled for the knife, all the while hearing his fists battering against the door. He didn't yell, didn't curse, just this relentless, violent pounding, like he was possessed by something that didn't tire or feel pain. After a few agonizing moments, the pounding stopped. I held my breath, gripping the knife tight, listening. Silence. My pulse pounded in my ears. I tried to peer through the small window, but all I could see was darkness. I knew he was still out there. I could feel it. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I lost track of time, just sitting there, clutching the knife and waiting for any sound. Then I heard the soft scrape of metal against metal, the sound of a lock being toyed with. My heart nearly stopped. I locked the door, hadn't I? How could he? I rushed to the door and found it slightly ajar. Somehow he'd managed to crack it open just enough. I shoved it shut, but as I did, something caught my eye. A makeshift tool, probably crafted from a piece of metal or wire wedged into the lock. He'd picked the lock. My blood ran cold. Just as I was bracing myself to push the door shut, a face appeared in the window. His face, inches away, his grin wider and more twisted than before, as if he was savoring every moment of my fear. He tapped the window with a crooked finger, then pressed his face against it, his mouth moving silently, mouthing words I couldn't make out. The tapping continued, rhythmic, taunting. I backed away slowly, moving further into the RV, realizing that I had only two options: wait him out or make a run for it. But where would I go? Outside was nothing but pitch-black wilderness. And if he could pick the lock, he'd get in eventually. The interior light flickered, once, twice, then went out completely. I froze, listening to the sound of his breathing against the window. My fingers traced along the wall until I found the emergency flashlight I kept mounted by the bed. When I clicked it on, the beam caught something that made my stomach drop. Muddy handprints smeared across the inside of the skylight above me. How long had he been in here before I arrived? What had he touched? What had he left? I made a decision. I was done sitting there like a scared rabbit. I grabbed a heavy wrench from under the sink, clenched it in my hand, and forced myself to step toward the door. If he was getting in, he'd have to go through me. As I neared the door, I heard a low chuckle from outside, followed by a whispered taunt. "You think you're safe in there?" His voice was rough, like he hadn't spoken in years, almost feral. Something snapped in me then. Anger replaced the fear, and I flung the door open, wrench raised, ready to swing. But he wasn't there. I looked around, breathing hard, the night swallowing up every sound. Just when I thought maybe he'd finally left, I heard his footsteps circling the RV, slow and deliberate, like he was toying with me. Then a loud crash. I spun around to see that he'd smashed the back window with a rock, shattering glass everywhere. I didn't wait for him to get inside. I bolted out the front door into the night, wrench still in my hand. I didn't have a plan, but I knew staying inside was a death sentence. I sprinted into the trees, branches scratching at my face, feet pounding the earth as I pushed deeper into the forest, trying to lose him in the maze of trees. Behind me, I could hear him crashing through the brush, laughing, that awful, guttural laugh that echoed through the forest. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they were going to give out. I found a thick cluster of trees and crouched down, trying to slow my breathing, trying to make myself invisible. The footsteps got closer, slower now, like he knew I was nearby. He was talking to himself, muttering words I couldn't make out, but it was clear he was enjoying this. I don't know how long I crouched there, but eventually his footsteps faded. I stayed there, still and silent, waiting to make sure he was gone. Finally, when I couldn't hear anything but the wind and my own heartbeat, I crept back toward the RV, hoping he'd left it. The RV was trashed. The back window was shattered, glass covering the floor, and the door hung open, swinging slightly in the breeze. I could see my things scattered, as if he'd been rifling through them. But he was gone. Just gone. I didn't stick around to question it. I threw whatever I could salvage back into the RV and got the hell out of there, driving down that winding forest road faster than I probably should have, not stopping until I was miles from that place. The headlights cut through the darkness, but every shadow along the road looked like him. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. I kept checking the rearview mirror, convinced I would see him standing in the middle of the road behind me, or worse, somehow clinging to the back of the RV. Around a sharp bend, my headlights caught something that made me slam on the brakes. A tree had fallen across the narrow road. The RV skidded to a stop just inches from the massive trunk. My first instinct was to back up, find another route, but then a terrible thought crossed my mind. What if he had done this? What if this was a trap? I sat there, engine idling, scanning the tree line on either side of the road. The forest seemed to press in closer, the shadows deeper and more threatening than before. I couldn't go forward, and I was terrified to go back. I was trapped. I grabbed the wrench again and stepped outside, keeping the engine running and the lights on. The fallen tree was massive, too big to move alone. As I approached it, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The cut at the base was fresh, a clean slice from a saw. This wasn't a natural fall. Someone had cut it deliberately. The sound of a twig snapping somewhere in the darkness sent me scrambling back to the RV. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and threw the vehicle into reverse. I'd find another way out, no matter how long it took. The narrow road made turning around impossible, so I began slowly backing up, constantly checking my mirrors. The road twisted and curved, making the reverse journey painfully slow. Each bend obscured my view of what lay behind, and more than once I had to stop and get out to check my path. During one such stop, I heard it, whistling, a tuneless, eerie sound that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. He was still out there, still hunting me. I made it back to the main junction and frantically consulted my map. There was another route, longer but wider, that would take me out of the forest. I turned onto it, praying it wasn't blocked as well. As I drove, the whistling faded, but the sense of being followed didn't. Every few minutes, I'd catch a glimpse of something in my mirror, a shadow moving between trees, the flash of what might have been headlights far behind me, gone when I looked again. Dawn was breaking when I finally reached the ranger station at the edge of the park. I pulled in, horn blaring, desperate for another human presence. The ranger who came out looked startled, then concerned as I stumbled from the RV, still clutching the wrench, clothes torn, face scratched from branches. Later, when I was safely out of those mountains, I did some digging. Found out that he was a drifter who'd been spotted in the area a few times. People said he lived up there, hiding out, getting by on whatever he could steal from campers and hikers. He'd been arrested a few times, always let go due to lack of evidence. But there were stories about him, stories that made my blood run cold. He'd attacked people before, had some sort of twisted thrill for it. The local sheriff's deputy took my statement with a detached professionalism that bordered on dismissive. "Probably just a vagrant," he said, flipping through his notepad. "We get reports like this from time to time. Folks get spooked in the woods, especially when they're camping alone." "This wasn't just getting spooked," I insisted, pointing to the shattered window of my RV, the scattered belongings. "He tried to get in. He followed me." The deputy nodded, but I could tell he'd already filed me away as another tourist who couldn't handle the isolation. "We'll keep an eye out," he assured me. "But these drifters, they move around a lot. Hard to track." I wasn't satisfied with that response, so I headed to the local library to do some research of my own. The librarian, an older woman with kind eyes and a wary expression, perked up when I mentioned my encounter. "Where exactly were you camping?" she asked, voice lowered though we were alone in the reference section. I showed her on the map, and she nodded slowly. "That area has a history," she said, pulling out a collection of local newspaper archives. "People go missing up there sometimes. Not often enough to raise alarms, but regular enough that locals know to avoid it." She helped me sift through years of local papers. Reports of hikers gone missing, campers who'd fled in the night with stories of being stalked, ransacked campsites. Most were attributed to wildlife, psychiatric episodes, or exaggerated fears, but the pattern was unmistakable. "There's a name some of the old-timers use," she said, hesitating. "They call him the Watcher. Been stories about him since I was a girl. My grandmother used to say he was once a normal man, a hunter who got lost in those mountains during a blizzard, survived by doing terrible things, came back changed. I thanked her for her help, though I wasn't sure what to make of the folklore angle. The man I'd encountered wasn't some supernatural entity. He was flesh and blood, dangerous and disturbed, but human nonetheless." Back at the motel, I spread out everything I'd learned across the bed. News clippings, printed forum posts from hikers who'd had strange encounters, a list of missing persons reports from the area over the past 20 years. 17 people who'd vanished without a trace, most dismissed as accidents, victims of the harsh terrain or wild animals. I called the numbers of a few people who'd reported encounters similar to mine. Most didn't want to talk, but one woman, Rebecca, agreed to meet me at a diner just outside of town. "I thought I was crazy," she said, clutching her coffee mug with trembling hands. "No one believed me, said I was just nervous about camping alone as a woman, but I know what I saw." Her story matched mine in unsettling ways, the watching, the circling, the taunting. But she'd escaped before he'd made his move, driving away in the middle of the night. "The Rangers found my campsite completely destroyed the next day," she said, like someone had torn through it in a rage, looking for me, I guess. As we talked, I noticed a man sitting alone in a booth across the diner, watching us intently. When our eyes met, he quickly looked away, but not before I caught something familiar in his gaze, a calculating coldness that set my nerves on edge. "We should go," I said to Rebecca, dropping cash on the table. "Now." Outside, I explained what I'd seen. We hurried to our cars, and as I watched her drive away, I caught sight of the man again, standing at the diner window, staring directly at me. It wasn't him, not the man from the forest, but there was something in his stance, his attention, that felt connected. That night, someone tried to break into my motel room. I woke to the sound of the doorknob rattling, saw the shadow of feet under the door. I called out, and the movement stopped. Then, whispered through the crack, "You should have stayed away from here." I left town the next morning, but I couldn't leave it behind. The experience stayed with me, lurking at the edges of my consciousness like a shadow I couldn't quite shake. I'd catch myself checking locks twice, 3 times before bed. I'd wake in the night convinced I'd heard tapping at my window. Every unfamiliar face on the street became a potential threat, every unexpected sound a warning. Months passed. I sold the RV, couldn't stand to look at it anymore, much less sleep in it. I moved to a new apartment in a busy neighborhood, surrounded by people and noise and light. I should have felt safer, but instead, I felt exposed, visible. The research folder stayed with me, growing thicker as I continued to dig into the history of the Gila wilderness and its secrets. I connected with more survivors online, people who'd had encounters they couldn't explain, who'd sensed that predatory presence watching them from the trees. We formed a loose network, sharing information, comparing notes. A pattern emerged. The attacks seemed to cluster around certain phases of the moon, certain times of year, as if he was following some internal calendar that only made sense to him. Then the emails started coming. Anonymous messages with no text, just coordinates. Locations in the forest where hikers had gone missing, where destroyed camps had been found. Someone was feeding me information, leading me deeper into the mystery. The final email contained a single image, a crude map drawn on what looked like a piece of bark, marking a location deep in the forest. Below it, scratched in what might have been blood, home. I knew I should take everything to the authorities, but my previous experience with the local sheriff left me doubtful they'd act. And something else held me back. A growing suspicion that whatever was happening in those mountains was known, tolerated, perhaps even protected by some in the community. Against all logic and self-preservation, I found myself driving back toward the Gila National Forest 6 months after my encounter. This time I was prepared, proper hiking gear, a satellite phone, a hunting knife, and most importantly, I wasn't alone. 2 others from our online group had agreed to join me. Marcus, a former Army Ranger whose brother had disappeared in the area 3 years earlier, and Tina, a wildlife photographer who'd captured something in the background of one of her shots that she couldn't explain. We established a base camp at a ranger-monitored site, giving us a safe place to return to each night. By day, we explored the areas marked on our collective maps, documenting everything, interviewing locals who'd spent their lives in the shadow of the mountains. On our third day, an elderly man approached us at a local diner. "You're looking for him," he said, not a question but a statement. "Been watching you ask around." He claimed to be a former search and rescue volunteer who'd spent decades in the mountains. "There are places up there," he told us, voice low, "where the forest feels wrong, where animals won't go, where the air sits heavy like something's watching, waiting." He marked a location on our map, his gnarled finger tracing a route up to a remote ridge. "There's a cave system there. We found things inside, evidence of someone living there. But the sheriff ordered us to leave it alone, said it was outside our jurisdiction." That night, as we prepared to check the location, Marcus received a call from the motel manager. Someone had broken into his room, left a warning scrawled on the bathroom mirror. "The forest keeps its secrets." We should have left then, reported everything and let professionals handle it. But we'd come too far, invested too much. The next morning, we headed into the wilderness, following the old man's directions. The hike was grueling, the terrain growing steadily more difficult as we ascended. Around midday, we noticed something odd. The forest had gone silent. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Just our labored breathing and the crunch of our boots on fallen leaves. The cave entrance was partially hidden behind a stand of dense pines, unremarkable except for the unnatural arrangement of stones around its mouth. Too deliberate to be coincidence, too irregular to be man-made in any conventional sense. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of decay. Our flashlights revealed a narrow passage that opened into a larger chamber. And there, in the flickering light, we found evidence of habitation. A crude sleeping area, stacks of items clearly stolen from campers and hikers over the years, walls covered in disturbing symbols and tallies. But it was the far wall that stole my breath. Photographs, dozens of them, pinned to the rock. Images of people in the forest, unaware they were being watched. Sleeping in tents, sitting by campfires, hiking on trails. And among them, to my horror, was a photo of me from that night 6 months ago, sitting by my fire, looking peaceful and unaware. We were so focused on the discovery that we didn't hear the footsteps until it was almost too late. A shadow fell across the cave entrance, blocking the natural light. We turned, flashlights raising in unison to illuminate the silhouette standing there. His eyes reflected the light like an animal's, and that same terrible grin spread across his face as he recognized me. "You came back," he said, his voice a rasp that echoed through the chamber. "They always come back." Behind him, more shadows moved, more figures emerging from the trees. Not one man, but many. A whole community of watchers living in these remote mountains, hunting together, sharing their spoils. As they advanced, I reached for the satellite phone, desperate to call for help. But I already knew the truth that had eluded me all these months. In these mountains, no one was coming to save us. Whatever happened next, we were entirely on our own. And as I faced the grinning drifter and his silent companions, I understood at last why the forest had gone so quiet. The predators were no longer hiding among the trees. They were standing right in front of us. The GPS had stopped working about 20 miles back, but I was too stubborn to admit we were lost. My girlfriend sat in the passenger seat, map spread across her lap, while our friend occupied the back seat with camping gear piled around her. We had planned this trip for months, desperate to escape the suffocating routine of city life. The main campground at Pine Lake had been our destination, but when we finally arrived after dark, every decent spot was occupied by families with massive RVs and generators humming through the night. "There has to be something further out," I muttered, squinting at the poorly lit campground directory. A park ranger, grizzled and weathered like he had spent decades in these woods, ambled over to our car. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness as he leaned down to my window. "Y'all looking for a place to pitch?" His voice carried the weight of too many late nights dealing with frustrated campers. When I nodded, he scratched his beard thoughtfully. "There's a primitive site about 3 miles down the old logging road. Most folks avoid it because there's no facilities, but it's free and quiet. He paused, studying our faces in the dim light. Real quiet. The way he emphasized those words should have been our first warning. Instead, I thanked him and followed his directions, turning onto a narrow dirt path that seemed to disappear into the forest. The headlights illuminated gnarled branches that scraped against the car windows, creating an unsettling symphony of scratches and groans. My girlfriend's fingers drummed nervously against the door handle. "This feels like the beginning of every horror movie ever made," our friend joked from the back seat. But her laughter sounded forced. The deeper we drove into the woods, the more the jokes faded into uncomfortable silence. The trees grew denser, their canopy blocking out even the faintest starlight. Our headlights seemed pathetically inadequate against the consuming darkness. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a small clearing barely large enough for our car and 2 tents. The moment I turned off the engine, the silence crashed over us like a physical weight. No distant highway noise, no other campers, no night sounds that typically populate a forest. Just absolute, oppressive quiet that made my ears ring. We sat in the car for several minutes, none of us eager to step outside. The headlights created a small bubble of illumination that only emphasized how thoroughly darkness surrounded us. Beyond that weak circle of light, anything could be watching, waiting, calculating our next move. Unloading our gear took twice as long as usual because we kept startling each other. Every rustle of fabric or clank of metal stakes sounded magnified in the stillness. My phone's flashlight provided barely enough illumination to see our hands, let alone properly set up camp. We worked in nervous whispers, as if speaking too loudly might attract unwanted attention from whatever lived in these woods. The ground beneath our feet felt wrong somehow, softer than it should be, with an odd springiness that suggested we were walking on layers of decomposing organic matter accumulated over decades. When I knelt to hammer and tent stakes, the soil gave way easily, releasing an earthy smell tinged with something else, something vaguely sweet and nauseating. My girlfriend struggled with her portion of the tent, her movements jerky with anxiety. "This place gives me the creeps," she whispered, glancing repeatedly at the tree line. "Why do you think that ranger recommended it? If it's so great, why isn't anyone else here?" Our friend had gone unusually quiet, focused intently on her own tent setup. When I asked if she was okay, she just nodded and continued working, but I noticed her hands shaking as she threaded the tent poles. The beam of her flashlight kept wandering toward the forest, as if she expected to see something moving between the trees. Once both tents were finally erected, we attempted to build a fire. The kindling we had brought seemed reluctant to catch, and even when flames finally took hold, they burned lower and dimmer than they should have. The fire cast dancing shadows that made the surrounding trees appear to shift and sway, creating the illusion of movement where there should have been stillness. We cooked hot dogs over the weak flames, but none of us had much appetite. The food tasted like ash, and every few minutes one of us would stop chewing to listen for sounds that never came. The silence pressed against our eardrums, making normal conversation feel forced and artificial. Even our laughter seemed to be absorbed by the darkness before it could properly echo. As we sat around the dying fire, our friend finally spoke about what had been bothering her. "I've been camping in these mountains my whole life," she said, staring into the flames. "But I've never been anywhere that felt this empty. It's like the forest is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen." Her words settled over us like a cold blanket, and I found myself scanning the darkness beyond our pitiful circle of light. The trees stood motionless, their branches creating intricate patterns against the star-filled sky. But something about their stillness felt deliberate, watchful. We retreated to our tents around 11 o'clock, though none of us felt particularly tired. The adrenaline of anxiety had kept us all wide awake and hyper-alert. My girlfriend and I squeezed into our 2-person tent, while our friend settled into her smaller shelter about 10 feet away. Before zipping up for the night, I conducted one final sweep of the area with my flashlight, checking for anything out of place. The beam revealed nothing unusual, just our car parked at the edge of the clearing and the dark wall of trees surrounding us on all sides. Yet something felt fundamentally wrong about the scene. The shadows seemed too deep, too complete, as if they were actively consuming light rather than simply existing in its absence. Inside the tent, we whispered to each other for nearly an hour, neither wanting to be the first to fall asleep. My girlfriend had brought a small battery-powered lantern, which we kept on its dimmest setting, creating a warm amber glow inside our nylon shelter. The light was comforting, but it also made us acutely aware of how thin the tent walls were, how little protection they actually provided. Sometime around midnight, I was finally drifting off when a sound cut through the silence like a blade. It started as a low moan, barely audible, then gradually rose in pitch and volume until it became a wailing cry that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound was neither human nor animal, but something in between. Something that spoke to a primal fear buried deep in human DNA. My girlfriend's fingernails dug into my arm as we both lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. The cry continued for what felt like minutes, rising and falling in waves, echoing off the trees and returning to us altered, distorted. When it finally faded, the silence that followed was even more oppressive than before. "What the hell was that?" my girlfriend whispered, her voice barely audible. I had no answer. In 25 years of camping and hiking, I had never heard anything remotely similar. It was too structured to be wind, too sustained to be a bird, too haunting to be any normal forest creature. The sound had seemed to come from the darkness itself, as if the night had found its voice and decided to announce its presence. We lay awake for another hour, straining our ears for any repeat performance, but heard nothing. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and we both fell into restless sleep. Our dreams filled with shadowy figures and echoing cries that followed us through twisted landscapes of our subconscious minds. I woke around 2:30 in the morning to the sound of careful footsteps circling our campsite. The steps were deliberate and measured, crunching softly on the gravel and fallen leaves with the rhythm of someone trying to move quietly but not quite succeeding. My first thought was that our friend had gotten up for a bathroom break. But as I listened more carefully, the footsteps seemed too heavy, too purposeful. The sound moved in a wide circle around both tents, pausing occasionally as if the walker was studying something, then continuing its slow circuit. I counted the steps, trying to gauge the size and gait of whatever was out there. The pattern suggested someone or something much larger than our petite friend, moving with the confidence of someone familiar with navigating in complete darkness. My girlfriend stirred beside me, her breathing changing as she fought her way back to consciousness. When she realized I was awake and listening, she pressed close to me, her body tense with fear. Together we tracked the footsteps as they completed another full circle of our camp, never venturing close enough to touch the tents, but never straying far enough to disappear entirely. "Should we check on her?" my girlfriend whispered so quietly I had to strain to hear her. Before I could answer, we heard our friend's voice from her tent, also whispering. "Are you guys awake? There's someone walking around out there." Her voice carried a tremor of barely controlled panic. The footsteps stopped immediately, as if the walker had heard our whispered conversation and was now listening to us as intently as we were listening to it. The silence stretched out for several minutes, during which none of us dared to speak or move. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I was certain it could be heard outside the tent. Just when I was beginning to think the danger had passed, the footsteps resumed, but now they moved differently. Instead of the previous methodical circling, they approached our tent directly, each step deliberate and heavy. The sound grew closer and closer, until I was certain the walker was standing just outside our tent wall, close enough to touch the fabric if they reached out their hand. We held our breath, waiting for what would come next. Part of me expected to see the tent wall push inward as someone pressed against it, or to hear the zipper being slowly pulled open, Instead, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, moving away from our campsite and disappearing into the forest. The silence that followed was so complete it felt like we had imagined the entire encounter. Around 4 in the morning, a strange light began filtering through the tent walls. At first I thought dawn was breaking early, which would have been a tremendous relief. The idea of surviving until daylight had become my primary focus, and any sign of approaching morning felt like salvation. But when I checked my phone, the screen showed 4:17 a.m., far too early for sunrise in late September. The light was wrong anyway, too pale and diffuse to be natural sunlight. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, creating an odd, flat illumination that made the tent walls glow with an eerie luminescence. My girlfriend noticed it too, and we both lay there staring at the strange radiance that surrounded us. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice tight with confusion and fear. I had no explanation. The light was bright enough to see by, but when I peered through a gap in the tent zipper, the forest outside appeared to be in complete darkness. It was as if the light existed only within our tent, or perhaps only in our perception. The contradiction made my head spin and my stomach churn with a mixture of anxiety and vertigo. Our friend called out softly from her tent, confirming that she was seeing the same phenomenon. Her voice sounded small and frightened, like a child afraid of monsters under the bed. The three of us were trapped in this bubble of impossible light, surrounded by a darkness that seemed more absolute than any natural night. The false dawn lasted for nearly an hour, during which none of us could fall back asleep. We whispered back and forth, trying to rationalize what we were experiencing, but every explanation sounded more ridiculous than the last. Gas leak from our camp stove causing hallucinations, reflection from some distant light source, mass hysteria brought on by isolation and fear. Nothing made sense, and the longer the light persisted, the more unsettling it became. There was something deeply wrong about light that existed without a source, illumination that defied the basic laws of physics and perception. It felt like a violation of natural order, a sign that we had stumbled into a place where normal rules no longer applied. When the light finally faded around 5:15, the darkness that replaced it seemed twice as thick and oppressive as before. The transition was gradual, like a dimmer switch being slowly turned down, until we were once again surrounded by the absolute blackness of deep forest night. Just as I was finally drifting back towards sleep, something pressed down hard on the lower portion of my sleeping bag, right where my feet were positioned. The pressure was firm and deliberate, as if someone was kneeling on the tent floor and leaning their weight against my legs. The fabric of the tent bent inward, creating a distinct depression that I could both see and feel. Terror shot through my nervous system like electricity, jolting me fully awake and triggering every survival instinct I possessed. Without thinking, I began thrashing and screaming, my voice raw and primal in the confines of the small tent. The sound was barely recognizable as human, more like the cry of a wounded animal fighting for its life. My girlfriend jerked awake beside me, confused and frightened by my sudden explosion of panic. She grabbed at my arms, trying to calm me down, but I continued to struggle against the invisible presence pressing down on my feet. The tent shook violently with my movements, the aluminum poles bending and creaking under the stress. "Stop! Stop!" my girlfriend hissed, her voice urgent with fear and confusion. "What's wrong? What's happened?" But I could not stop. The pressure on my feet felt real and immediate, a tangible threat that my panicked mind interpreted as an attack. I kicked and twisted, trying to free myself from whatever was holding me down, my breathing coming in sharp, desperate gasps that fogged the air inside the tent. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 or 40 seconds, the pressure suddenly released. The tent walls sprang back to their normal position, and I found myself free to move. I lay there panting, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst, while my girlfriend stared at me with wide, frightened eyes. "There was something on my feet," I gasped, trying to explain what had happened. "Something heavy, pressing down." but even as I said the words, they sounded insane. How could something press down on my feet from outside the tent without leaving any evidence? How could a physical presence simply vanish without a trace? Our friend called out from her tent, her voice shaky with concern. She had heard my screaming and wanted to know if we were okay. The idea that my terror had been loud enough to wake her made me feel exposed and vulnerable, as if I had announced our location to every dangerous thing in the forest. We whispered back and forth through the tent walls, trying to piece together what had happened, but none of us had answers that made sense. The incident felt simultaneously real and impossible, like something from a nightmare that had somehow bled into waking reality. Despite our fear, we could not simply lie in our tents pretending nothing had happened. The need to understand what was going on finally overcame our terror, and I made the decision to venture outside and investigate. My girlfriend begged me not to leave the tent, but I could not shake the feeling that remaining passive was somehow more dangerous than taking action. I unzipped the tent flap with trembling fingers, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar outline of our campsite, but everything looked different now, more sinister and threatening. The shadows seemed deeper, the spaces between objects more mysterious and concealing. I crawled out of the tent slowly, every muscle in my body coiled and ready to bolt back inside at the first sign of danger. The ground around our tent showed no evidence of disturbance, no footprints or compressed areas where someone might have knelt or crouched. The absence of physical evidence made the experience feel even more unsettling, as if reality itself had become unreliable. Our friend emerged from her tent at the same time, her flashlight beam joining mine in scanning the area. Together, we conducted a thorough search of the campsite, looking for any sign of what had caused the pressure on my feet or the footsteps we had heard earlier. We examined every inch of ground, every nearby tree, every possible hiding spot where someone or something might have concealed itself. We found nothing. No tracks, no disturbed vegetation, no physical evidence that anyone had been in our campsite except for us. The discovery was both relieving and terrifying. If there was no intruder, then what had we experienced? Were we all losing our minds simultaneously, falling victim to some form of mass hysteria brought on by isolation and fear? "This place is wrong," our friend said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to leave. Now." Looking around at the dark trees that surrounded us, their branches reaching toward our small circle of light like grasping fingers, I could not disagree. Whatever was happening here defied rational explanation, but our fear was real enough. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to pack up and get out while we still could. My girlfriend poked her head out of the tent, her face pale in the flashlight beam. "Please," she said. "Let's just go. I can't take any more of this." We broke camp in record time, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate need to escape whatever had claimed this patch of wilderness. Working by flashlight, we stuffed sleeping bags and collapsed tents with frantic efficiency, not bothering with the careful packing we had done on arrival. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every sound made us freeze and listen for approaching danger. The car had never looked so welcoming as it did in those pre-dawn hours, its familiar bulk representing safety and normalcy in a world that had become alien and hostile. We threw our gear into the trunk and back seat without organization, our only goal to get everything loaded and get moving as quickly as possible. As I started the engine, the headlights illuminated the campsite one final time. In that brief moment before we drove away, I could have sworn I saw movement in the tree line, just at the edge of the light's reach. Something tall and dark that seemed to shift and withdraw the moment the headlights touched it. But when I looked more carefully, there was nothing there but trees and shadows. We drove in silence down the narrow dirt road, none of us willing to speak until we reached the main highway. The familiar sight of pavement and road signs felt like crossing back into the real world after spending time in some alternate dimension where normal rules did not apply. Only when we were safely surrounded by streetlights and the distant glow of civilization did we finally begin to breathe normally again. Miles later, sitting in a 24-hour diner with coffee growing cold in our hands, we tried to make sense of what had happened. The fluorescent lights and plastic booth seats felt wonderfully mundane after our night in the woods, but the memory of that place lingered like a bad taste. "We all experienced the same things," our friend said, stirring sugar into her coffee with shaking hands. "The sounds, the light, the feeling of being watched. That has to mean something." I nodded, but I was not sure what it meant. Mass hallucination seemed impossible, but so did everything else we had experienced. The rational part of my mind kept searching for logical explanations, while a deeper, more primitive part simply wanted to forget the whole experience and never return to those woods. Even now, months later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night feeling that same pressure on my feet, hearing those deliberate footsteps circling just outside my bedroom. The memory of that place has lodged itself deep in my consciousness, a reminder that there are still corners of the world where humans are not welcome, where ancient forces hold sway over the darkness and the silence. We never went back to find out what we had encountered in those woods. Some questions, I have learned, are better left unanswered. Some places are meant to remain empty, avoided by those wise enough to recognize danger when they feel it pressing down on them in the dark hours before dawn. I've lived near Ridgemont National Park for almost my entire life. Growing up just 10 minutes from its boundary meant the wilderness became my second home, a sanctuary where I could escape whenever life became overwhelming. The dense forests, winding trails, and the majestic waterfalls of Ridgemont have been constants in my life. Places of comfort rather than fear. My connection to these woods began in childhood when my father would take me hiking every Sunday without fail. "Nature is the greatest teacher," he'd say as we navigated rocky paths or identified bird calls echoing through the trees. Even after he passed away 7 years ago, I continued our tradition, finding solace in the familiar routes we once walked together. I'm not the type who startles easily. Years of wilderness exploration have taught me to respect nature rather than fear it. I've encountered black bears, weathered unexpected storms, and spent nights alone under starlit skies without incident. The rational part of my brain has always overridden any primal fear response, until that autumn day last October. The morning had started like any other. I woke before sunrise, prepared my hiking gear with practiced efficiency, and checked the weather forecast. Partly cloudy, mild temperatures, perfect conditions for a day on the trails. I decided to take my companion Scooter, a medium-sized mixed-breed dog I'd rescued as a puppy 7 years earlier. Scooter embodied everything you could want in a hiking partner: steady temperament, excellent trail discipline, and an intuitive understanding of the outdoors. He never barked unnecessarily, maintained a consistent pace beside me, and somehow always sensed potential dangers before I noticed them. His brown coat with scattered white patches made him blend seamlessly with the autumn woodland palette. As we pulled into the nearly empty parking area that bordered the eastern entrance to Ridgemont Falls, I noticed how the pale sky created a striking backdrop for the vibrant foliage. Bright crimson maples stood proudly among amber oaks and gold-leaved birches. The seasonal display promised a visually spectacular hike. "Ready for an adventure, boy?" I asked, clipping Scooter's leash as he hopped eagerly from the passenger seat. His tail wagged with anticipation, his nose already sampling the rich autumn scents, decomposing leaves, damp earth, and the distant mineral tang of the waterfalls. The trailhead welcomed us with its familiar wooden signpost, slightly weathered but still clearly marking the various paths that sprawled through the park. I chose the Hemlock Ridge Trail, a moderately challenging route that would lead us to the upper viewing point of Sentinel Falls, the park's most impressive cascade. Though popular during summer months, autumn weekdays typically offered welcome solitude. We set off at a comfortable pace, boots and paws crunching rhythmically through scattered leaves. The forest embraced us immediately, tall trees forming a protective canopy overhead, sunlight filtering through in dappled patterns that shifted with each gentle breeze. The air felt crisp against my face, carrying that distinct autumn fragrance that somehow smells simultaneously of ending and beginning. Scooter trotted beside me contentedly, occasionally stopping to investigate an interesting scent or watch a squirrel scrambling up a nearby trunk. His behavior was entirely normal, relaxed, curious, but consistently attentive to our shared path. Nothing in his demeanor suggested any cause for concern. About 40 minutes into our hike, we stopped at a small clearing I'd visited countless times before. A fallen oak provided the perfect natural bench, and I unwrapped a protein bar while Scooter lapped water from the collapsible bowl I always carried. The distant sound of rushing water reached us even here, promising the falls were running strong after recent rainfall. "We'll reach the upper viewpoint in another hour," I told Scooter, who cocked his head as if understanding every word. "Then maybe we'll try that unmarked trail to the rocky outcrop. You remember? The one with the amazing view of the lower cascade." As we continued our journey, the terrain gradually steepened. The trail narrowed in places, forcing us to navigate between rocky outcroppings and exposed tree roots. The forest around us changed subtly too. More hemlock and pine now, creating deeper shadows and a hushed atmosphere broken only by the increasing roar of falling water. What I didn't realize then was how this ordinary beginning would lead to the most unsettling experience of my life. Looking back, I searched for warning signs I might have missed. Some indication that this day would be fundamentally different from hundreds of similar hikes. But there was nothing obvious, nothing that would have made me turn back. By midday, we had covered nearly 5 miles of trail, working our way steadily toward our destination. The main waterfall was now audible as a constant background rumble, growing louder with each step forward. Occasional glimpses of white water flashed between trees as the path wound closer to the river that fed the falls. "Almost there," I murmured to Scooter, who matched my stride with practiced ease. Neither of us could have predicted what awaited us at Sentinel Falls, an encounter that would challenge everything I thought I understood about Ridgemont National Park and my own perception of reality. The approach to Sentinel Falls follows a gradual descent through increasingly dense woodland. As Scooter and I made our way down the final stretch of trail, I noticed subtle shifts in the atmosphere around us. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, though this wasn't unusual near waterways. What struck me as odd was the sudden absence of wildlife sounds. No birds calling, no rustling in the underbrush, just the persistent thunder of cascading water growing louder with each step. Scooter, typically relaxed on our hikes, began exhibiting unusual behavior. His ears pricked forward, then back, as if trying to locate a sound beyond my human hearing range. He slowed his pace, no longer leading eagerly, but staying unusually close to my legs. When we paused at a trail junction, he sat pressed against my calf, eyes scanning the trees in a deliberate, focused pattern I'd never observed before. "What is it, buddy?" I asked, kneeling beside him and following his gaze. The forest looked normal, a rich tapestry of autumn colors, shadows stretching as afternoon light filtered through branches. Nothing appeared out of place, yet I couldn't shake a growing sense of disquiet, as if we were being observed. We continued toward the falls, now following the path that ran alongside the river. The water moved rapidly here, tumbling over smooth stones worn down by centuries of persistent flow. Normally, I would have paused to appreciate the natural beauty, perhaps take some photographs of sunlight refracting through spray. Instead, I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, scanning the tree line for something I couldn't define. "Just being paranoid," I muttered to myself, forcing my attention back to the trail. Scooter wasn't convinced. His movements had become deliberately cautious, each paw placed with unusual precision as if testing the ground before committing his weight. His tail, normally held high in confident exploration, now hung in a neutral position, not frightened, but unmistakably alert. The main viewing platform for Sentinel Falls appeared ahead, a sturdy wooden structure extending slightly over the lower pool. On weekends, this area would typically host dozens of visitors, but today we had it entirely to ourselves. The solitude, usually welcome, now felt strangely oppressive. I approached the railing, Scooter reluctantly following. The falls presented a magnificent sight, water plummeting nearly 80 feet in a powerful, unbroken column before crashing into a churning pool below. Clouds of mist rose from the impact point, creating miniature rainbows where sunlight penetrated the spray. It should have been awe-inspiring. Instead, as I stood watching the hypnotic flow, an inexplicable sense of wrongness crept over me. The feeling wasn't precisely fear, not yet. Rather, it resembled the disorientation experienced upon entering a familiar room to find furniture subtly rearranged. Everything appeared correct at first glance, but something fundamental had shifted just beyond conscious recognition. "Let's check out that rocky viewpoint," I suggested to Scooter, partly to reassure myself through normalcy. The unmarked trail branching off to the right wasn't officially maintained by park rangers, but had been created through years of hikers seeking a more dramatic perspective of the falls. I'd visited it several times before, always rewarded with spectacular views of both upper and lower Cascades. As we left the main trail, following the narrow dirt path through denser vegetation, Scooter's reluctance became more pronounced. Twice he stopped completely, looking back toward the main trail with what I can only describe as longing. Each time I encouraged him forward, he complied, but with none of his usual enthusiasm. The side trail wound upward, requiring occasional use of exposed tree roots as natural steps. After about 10 minutes of steady climbing, we emerged onto the rocky outcrop, a flat stone shelf jutting from the hillside approximately 30 feet above the main viewing platform. From this vantage point, the entirety of Sentinel Falls was visible, from its origin point where the river narrowed dramatically before its plunge, to the widening pools below where white water gradually calmed into rippling currents. I moved toward the edge, maintaining a safe distance from the sheer drop. Scooter, usually content to explore secure areas of such viewpoints, remained unusually stationary, positioning himself between me and the trail we descended. His posture had changed completely. Legs stiff, head lowered slightly, attention fixed on something beyond my field of vision. That's when I noticed the silence. Despite standing mere yards from a powerful waterfall, the sound seemed muffled, as if heard through thick glass. The mist rising from below moved oddly too, not following natural air currents but swirling in patterns that suggested deliberate formation. I blinked hard, attributing these perceptions to fatigue or perhaps the unusual lighting created by the pale autumn sky. When I reopened my eyes, everything appeared normal again, water falling naturally, sound restored to its proper volume. Yet Scooter remained tense, unconvinced by whatever adjustment my mind had made. "It's okay," I assured him, though uncertainty had crept into my voice. "Just a weird, atmospheric thing." We stayed at the viewpoint for perhaps 15 minutes, during which Scooter never relaxed his vigilant stance. I tried focusing on the natural beauty surrounding us, taking deep breaths of mist-laden air, attempting to recapture the peace these woods had always provided. But something fundamental had changed, a shift in perception that transformed familiar terrain into something vaguely threatening. As we prepared to descend back to the main trail, I caught a glimpse of movement at the waterfall's edge. Not within the water itself, but beside it, where dense vegetation bordered the cliff face. Just a momentary displacement, like a shadow adjusting to changed light. I focused on the area but saw nothing conclusive, just leaves stirring in patterns slightly discordant with the prevailing breeze. "Time to head back," I announced, more for my benefit than Scooter's. He needed no encouragement, immediately turning toward the descent path with unusual eagerness. As we navigated the steep sections of trail, I noticed my heartbeat had accelerated beyond what physical exertion warranted. My palms felt clammy despite the cool air, and I found myself frequently checking our surroundings rather than watching my footing. When we rejoined the main trail, Scooter's behavior changed again, not reverting to normal relaxation, but shifting to a new alertness directed specifically toward the area downstream from the falls. His muscles tensed beneath his fur, and a low sound vibrated in his throat. Not quite a growl, but the precursor to one. That's when I saw it for the first time. A figure standing partially obscured by foliage near the lower pool, approximately 50 yards downstream. The distance and intervening vegetation prevented clear details, but its general shape suggested a person of average height, motionless among the trees. I raised my hand in greeting, expecting a reciprocal acknowledgement from another hiker. No response came. The figure remained completely still, positioned at an angle that suggested it was watching us but offering no confirmation through movement or gesture. I lowered my hand slowly, a creeping unease spreading through my chest as I realized how oddly the figure was situated. Not on any established trail, standing in an area of dense undergrowth that would be difficult to navigate intentionally. "Hello?" I called, my voice nearly lost in the ambient sounds of rushing water. Again, no response or movement followed. Scooter's earlier tension had intensified, his body pressed against my leg as if seeking protection while simultaneously offering it. When I took an instinctive step forward, he moved with me, maintaining contact, but clearly reluctant to approach whatever, or whoever, stood watching us from the shadows. After several uncomfortable moments, I decided against investigation. The rational part of my brain suggested another hiker exploring off-trail, perhaps a photographer seeking unique angles of the waterfall. But deeper instincts, the same primal warning system humans have carried since our earliest evolutionary stages, advised retreat. "Let's go, boy," I murmured, turning back toward the main trail that would return us to the parking area. Scooter didn't hesitate, immediately adopting a pace slightly faster than our typical hiking speed. As we moved away, I fought the overwhelming urge to look back, focusing instead on the path ahead and the rhythmic sound of our movement through scattered leaves. When we'd covered perhaps 100 yards, I finally surrendered to compulsion and glanced over my shoulder. The area where the figure had stood appeared empty now, showing only undisturbed vegetation. Relief washed through me briefly, followed by uncertainty. Had I imagined the entire encounter? Scooter's continued alertness suggested otherwise. His behavior confirmed that something unusual had occurred, something beyond normal wilderness experiences. As we continued our return journey, neither of us fully relaxed. The beautiful autumn forest, so familiar and comforting just hours earlier, now seemed filled with hidden recesses where unknown things might lurk just beyond perception. We maintained our accelerated pace until reaching the wider, more frequented sections of trail closer to the park entrance. Only then did Scooter's posture begin to normalize, his movements becoming more fluid and less defensive. My own tension dissipated more slowly, rational thought gradually reasserting control over instinctive responses. By the time we reached the parking area, I had nearly convinced myself that the entire experience stemmed from some combination of unusual lighting, natural wildlife movement, and overactive imagination. Almost convinced, but not entirely. Something about the motionless figure and the strange atmosphere surrounding the falls remained troubling in ways I couldn't easily dismiss. As we drove away from Ridgemont that afternoon, I made a mental note to research whether others had reported unusual experiences in the area. What I didn't realize then was that this initial encounter represented merely the beginning, the first indication of something deeply unsettling that would eventually draw me back to Sentinel Falls under circumstances far more terrifying than I could possibly imagine. 2 weeks passed before I returned to Ridgemont National Park. Despite attempts to dismiss my previous experience as imagination, questions lingered, persistent enough to prompt research into local folklore and incident reports. What I discovered only deepened my unease. While finding no official documentation of strange occurrences, online forums revealed dozens of anecdotal accounts describing unusual experiences near Sentinel Falls. Most mentioned feelings of being watched. Several described inexplicable sounds. A few, those that truly disturbed me, detailed sightings of a dark figure observing hikers from various points around the waterfall. These reports spanned decades, with the earliest dating to the 1970s when the park first opened to public access. What struck me most wasn't their consistency in describing physical details. These varied widely, but the emotional impact recorded by each witness. Person after person described the same visceral response. Deep instinctive dread accompanied by certainty of being observed by something fundamentally wrong. I shared these findings with nobody. My friends would certainly mock such ghost stories, and I wasn't prepared to label my experience supernatural. Something had occurred at Sentinel Falls, something I couldn't explain through normal parameters, but jumping to paranormal conclusions seemed premature. Instead, I decided to return alone. Scooter's reaction during our previous visit, while validating my own perceptions, introduced an additional variable I wanted to eliminate. If something unusual existed in those woods, I needed to encounter it with only my own senses as witnesses. I chose a Tuesday morning, arriving at the eastern trailhead shortly after sunrise. The parking area stood empty, mist rising from damp ground as early light filtered through nearly bare trees. Most autumn foliage had fallen now, creating a carpet of decomposing leaves that muffled my footsteps as I began the familiar hike toward the falls. The forest appeared entirely normal, birds calling from remaining branches, occasional rustling as small mammals navigated ground cover, the distant sound of water gradually increasing as I approached my destination. Without Scooter's reactions to influence me, I found myself questioning whether I'd constructed an entire narrative from coincidental natural occurrences. I reached the main viewing platform approximately 90 minutes after setting out. The waterfall thundered impressively, its volume increased by recent rainfall. Spray created a perpetual dampness on surrounding rocks and vegetation, droplets catching morning light like suspended diamonds. Standing alone before this natural power, my previous fears seemed almost laughable. After spending several minutes appreciating the view from the official platform, I made a deliberate decision to follow the unofficial trail to the rocky outcrop where my previous discomfort had begun. The path seemed narrower than I remembered, vegetation pressing closer on either side, creating an enclosed feeling despite being in open woodland. Each step upward required more effort than memory suggested, as if the trail itself resisted my progress. Rational thought attributed this to ground softened by autumn precipitation, but subconscious impressions suggested something more intentional. A gradual increase in resistance designed to discourage further advancement. I persisted, emerging finally onto the familiar stone shelf with its panoramic view of the falls. Morning light illuminated the cascade differently than during my previous visit, penetrating deeper into rising mist and revealing more detail in the rock face behind flowing water. For several minutes I simply observed, cataloging every visible aspect of the scene for later comparison. That's when I noticed the first anomaly, a section of waterfall that didn't move correctly. While the main flow followed normal gravitational patterns, one peripheral stream along the eastern edge appeared to pause momentarily at irregular intervals, creating a strobe-like effect visible only when observed directly. I focused intently on this section, wondering if some unusual rock formation beneath the surface created the visual distortion. As I concentrated, the effect intensified rather than resolved. Water not merely pausing now, but occasionally appearing to move upward against gravity for millisecond intervals. Optical illusion, I said aloud, my voice immediately absorbed by ambient noise. Light refraction through spray. The logical explanation comforted me briefly until I realized another change had occurred while my attention fixed on the water. The quality of sound surrounding me had altered. The waterfall's roar remained constant in volume, but had somehow hollowed, taking on an echoing quality as if heard from within a massive empty chamber rather than open woodland. I turned slowly, surveying the entire area from my elevated position. Nothing visibly unusual presented itself. Just forest, rock, water, morning mist. Yet the sensation of wrongness intensified with each passing moment, raising hairs along my arms and neck despite completely rational surroundings. When I turned back toward the falls, everything changed. Standing on a narrow ledge beside the main cascade, a position impossible to reach without specialized climbing equipment, was the figure. No longer distant or partially obscured, it now occupied a clearly visible position approximately 40 feet from my location. Though completely exposed in daylight, details remained frustratingly indistinct, as if light bent abnormally around its form. Height and general shape suggested human proportions, but something in its posture communicated profound wrongness. Limbs angled slightly inappropriately, torso leaning beyond natural balance points without falling. Had it been wearing dark clothing, or was that its actual coloration? Even with direct observation, these basic details remained ambiguous. What registered with absolute clarity was its orientation, directly facing me with unwavering attention. Though I could discern no facial features through the visual distortion surrounding it, awareness of being observed penetrated to my core. This was no coincidence of shared space. This entity, I could no longer think of it as potentially human, had positioned itself specifically to interact with me. "Who are you?" I called, surprised by the steadiness in my voice despite adrenaline flooding my system. No response came, just continued unnatural stillness. Not the normal stillness of a person attempting to remain motionless. Even breath and subtle shifting would be visible at this distance, but complete absence of micro-movements that distinguish living things from inanimate objects. I raised my hand, palm outward, offering a universal gesture of peaceful acknowledgement. For several heartbeats, nothing changed. Then, with movement too fluid to follow properly, the figure raised its own appendage in apparent mimicry. The gesture should have been reassuring, suggesting communication attempted. Instead, it provoked instant, overwhelming terror. The movement wasn't merely unnatural, it was wrong in ways my mind struggled to process. The limb extended too far, joints articulating at impossible angles, the entire motion occurring without proper correlation to physical mass. What appeared superficially human revealed itself as something fundamentally different merely through this simple action. I stepped backward involuntarily, nearly losing balance on the uneven surface of the outcrop. Instinct urged immediate retreat, yet some combination of fascination and disbelief kept me rooted in place. If this entity meant harm, why remain at distance? If attempting communication, why not approach or speak? As these questions formed, the figure tilted its head at an angle exceeding normal vertebral rotation. The movement conveyed unmistakable inquiry. It was studying my reactions, cataloging my responses, learning through observation just as I attempted to understand it. The realization broke my paralysis. Whatever stood watching me from that impossible perch represented something beyond my experience or comprehension. Further interaction without understanding posed risks I wasn't prepared to accept. I turned toward the descent path, moving with deliberate calm despite every nerve screaming for rapid escape. 3 steps down the trail, I succumbed to compulsion and looked back. The ledge stood empty. My eyes darted frantically, searching surrounding areas for where the figure might have moved. Nothing appeared among trees or rocks. No movement disturbed vegetation along potential paths of travel. Complete disappearance within seconds, without sound or visible transition, defied logical explanation. Abandoning pretense of calm, I descended the trail at dangerous speed, nearly falling several times as my boots slipped on damp surfaces. Reaching the main trail, I paused momentarily, gasping for breath while scanning surrounding forest. Normal woodland sounds had returned. Birds calling, leaves rustling, water flowing without acoustic distortion. I should have left immediately, returned directly to my vehicle and the safety of civilization. Instead, some irrational compulsion drew me closer to the base of the falls, toward the pool where thundering water created constant white noise and perpetual mist obscured clear vision. Approaching the water's edge, I studied the churning surface. Dark in deeper sections, transparent where it flowed over smooth stones. Nothing unusual presented itself initially. Then, as my breathing slowed and eyes adjusted to the interplay of light and moisture, I noticed a reflection. Not my own image mirrored on the water's surface, but 2 points of light beneath it, seemingly suspended in deeper water where natural illumination shouldn't penetrate. They resembled eyes catching light, similar to nocturnal animals reflected in headlights. Yet this was broad daylight, and the positioning made no biological sense. I leaned forward for better perspective, careful to maintain secure footing on slippery rocks. The points of light shifted slightly, not floating with water movement but adjusting position independently, maintaining orientation toward me despite changing angle of observation. A voice behind me shattered the moment. "Beautiful spot, isn't it?" I spun around, heart hammering, to find an elderly man standing several yards away on the main trail. He wore standard hiking gear and carried a walking stick, presenting the perfect image of a regular park visitor enjoying morning exercise. "Yes," I managed to respond, voice steadier than expected given my internal state. "Spectacular." "Been coming here 40 years, the man continued, apparently oblivious to my distress. "Never gets old." I glanced back toward the water. The strange lights had vanished, leaving only normal reflections on disturbed surface. When I returned attention to my unexpected companion, his expression had changed subtly. Eyes narrowed slightly, head tilted in evaluation. "You saw something," he stated rather than asked. Not accusatory, but knowing, as if confirming a long-held theory. "What do you mean?" I countered, reluctant to validate experiences I still couldn't properly categorize. The man gestured vaguely toward the falls with his walking stick. "These old places have memories. Sometimes they take shape." He paused, studying my face. "Not everyone notices." Before I could formulate a response, he nodded politely and continued along the trail, soon disappearing around a bend without further comment. His casual acknowledgement of something inexplicable somehow disturbed me more than the encounter itself. Suggesting others had experienced similar phenomena, yet local consensus maintained silence. I remained at the pool's edge for several more minutes, scanning water surfaces and surrounding terrain for any further anomalies. Nothing appeared, yet conviction grew that something continued observing from concealment. Patient, interested, fundamentally other. Finally, practicality overcame curiosity. Whatever presence inhabited Sentinel Falls clearly operated beyond normal parameters. Further investigation required preparation and possibly assistance. I began the return journey to the parking area, moving at deliberate pace while remaining vigilantly aware of my surroundings. The forest seemed to have returned to normal, sunlight strengthening as morning advanced, wildlife active throughout visible areas, trails solid and predictable beneath my boots. Yet subtle wrongness persisted in peripheral awareness. Occasional sounds slightly disjointed from natural origins. Movements among distant vegetation that didn't correlate with wind patterns. Momentary temperature fluctuations without environmental cause. Reaching my vehicle without further incident provided little relief. Questions multiplied rather than resolved, centered on fundamental uncertainty. Had I experienced something objectively real, or were these events products of psychological projection? The elderly hiker's comments suggested external validation, yet his appearance and departure seemed suspiciously convenient. As I drove away from Ridgemont that morning, one certainty formed amid confusion. I would return to Sentinel Falls. Whatever presence resided there had revealed itself intentionally, initiated contact deliberately. Our interaction felt incomplete, a conversation interrupted rather than concluded. What I couldn't possibly know then was how that return would transform everything, not just my understanding of Ridgemont National Park, but my entire conception of reality and the boundaries separating known from unknowable. The drive home passed in a blur of automatic functions, hands steering, feet operating pedals, eyes registering traffic signals, while my conscious mind remained trapped in continuous replay of the waterfall encounter. Each mental review revealed new details previously overlooked. How ambient temperature had dropped immediately before the figure appeared. The way certain birds had fallen silent while others continued normal calls. Subtle distortions in peripheral vision that might have indicated additional presences beyond the one directly observed. I arrived home mid-afternoon, physically exhausted despite minimal exertion. My small house, normally a sanctuary of comfort and familiarity, felt suddenly exposed. Too many windows overlooking dense woodland that bordered my property, too many shadows lingering in corners despite bright sunshine outside. After securing doors and drawing blinds against imagined observation, I collapsed onto my sofa and attempted to process the morning's events through rational frameworks. The most obvious explanation involved hallucination, perhaps triggered by environmental factors like toxic spores from forest fungi or natural gas leaking from subterranean pockets near the waterfall. Such phenomena could explain visual distortions, altered sound perception, and the overwhelming sense of wrongness that accompanied the experience. Yet this theory failed to account for multiple witnesses reporting similar encounters over decades. Unless Sentinel Falls somehow induced mass hallucination affecting specific individuals across generations, physical explanation seemed inadequate. The alternative, that something genuinely anomalous existed in those woods, opened possibilities I'd spent my adult life dismissing as superstition and folklore. I'd always approached unexplained phenomena with healthy skepticism, finding rational explanations behind supposedly supernatural events. Now, personal experience challenged fundamental assumptions about reality's consistent operation. My computer beckoned from across the room, promising access to information that might contextualize my experience. After brief hesitation, I succumbed to curiosity and began systematically researching Ridgemont National Park's history, beyond tourist information and trail guides. What emerged through careful investigation painted a disturbing picture of the area surrounding Sentinel Falls. Before park establishment in the early 1970s, those specific acres had witnessed disproportionate tragedy. Multiple disappearances never resolved, accidents exceeding statistical probability, even documented cases of experienced hikers becoming inexplicably disoriented despite clear weather and familiar terrain. Most incidents lacked spectacular details, just ordinary people encountering extraordinary misfortune in apparently random patterns. Only when viewed collectively across time did disturbing consistency emerge: proximity to the waterfall, occurrence during transition seasons, primarily spring and fall, and the complete absence of clear resolution in most cases. Official records attributed these events to natural hazards, slippery rocks, flash flooding, wildlife encounters, or simple navigational errors. Yet witness statements, where available, frequently contained unsettling commonalities: reports of being watched, unusual atmosphere surrounding the falls, and occasional mentions of a shadowy presence observed shortly before misfortune occurred. As evening approached, my research shifted from documented incidents to local legends predating European settlement. Information proved sparse, filtered through unreliable translations and cultural misinterpretations, but certain elements appeared consistently across sources. Indigenous peoples who originally inhabited the region apparently considered the waterfall location spiritually significant, not as sacred ground to be revered, but as a boundary area requiring specific protocols before approach. Fragmentary references suggested belief in a watcher or guardian associated with the falling water, neither malevolent nor benevolent but fundamentally neutral, an observer of human activity rather than participant. Some translations implied this entity preserved balance between worlds through continual vigilance, while others suggested it merely documented human presence without purpose beyond observation itself. The similarities between centuries-old beliefs and my personal experience proved unsettling. Though rational explanation remained possible, perhaps modern witnesses unconsciously incorporated elements of folklore they'd encountered previously, the concept of collective imagination creating consistent manifestations across generations seemed only marginally more plausible than accepting some form of objectively real phenomenon. Night had fallen completely by the time I exhausted available research sources. My house creaked with normal settling sounds that suddenly seemed significant. Shadows shifted with passing car headlights in patterns that momentarily resembled deliberate movement. Fatigue, combined with heightened alertness, created an uncomfortable mental state where logical thought competed with instinctive responses. Sleep seemed impossible, yet necessary. I moved mechanically through evening routines, showering, preparing simple food I barely tasted, securing the house with double checks of locks and windows. When finally lying in darkness, eyes fixed on ceiling patterns while mind continued processing implications of discovered information, a new realization formed with disturbing clarity. The watcher I'd encountered hadn't appeared randomly during my visit. Its manifestation followed my deliberate decision to investigate the rocky outcrop, a location outside sanctioned trails, offering perspective unavailable from official viewing areas. My choice to leave established boundaries had apparently triggered observation. This perspective recontextualized previous witness accounts. Perhaps the entity only revealed itself to those who demonstrated willingness to venture beyond conventional limitations, physical boundaries becoming metaphorical representations of conceptual thresholds. If accurate, this theory suggested intentionality behind encounters rather than random manifestation. The question remaining, why me specifically, offered no satisfactory answer. Nothing distinguished my circumstances from thousands of other hikers who explored Ridgemont annually. I possessed no special sensitivity to paranormal phenomena, maintained no spiritual practices that might attune perception to alternate realities. I represented the quintessential ordinary witness, making my experience simultaneously more credible and more disturbing. Morning arrived after intermittent sleep, punctuated by dreams too fragmented for clear recall, but leaving emotional residue of profound disquiet. Daylight restored some rational perspective, allowing professional obligations and daily necessities to temporarily override obsessive analysis of the previous day's events. Yet throughout normal activities, awareness of unfinished business lingered. The encounter at Sentinel Falls felt incomplete. A communication initiated but not concluded, an interaction suspended rather than resolved. This perception carried uncomfortable implications that something might expect continuation, might consider our connection ongoing despite physical separation. I spent 3 days in this state of functional normalcy overlaying deep unease. Regular routines provided surface comfort while deeper awareness monitored surroundings for anomalies. Small inconsistencies, a book not quite where I remembered placing it, unexplained sounds from empty rooms, momentary glimpses of movement in reflective surfaces, accumulated into persistent background anxiety. Sleep deteriorated further, leading to micro-sleep episodes during waking hours where consciousness briefly suspended. During these moments, hypnagogic imagery consistently featured water flowing in impossible directions and dark figures standing just beyond direct vision. Each episode lasted mere seconds, but left lingering disorientation that complicated normal functioning. By the 4th evening following my encounter, physical exhaustion demanded resolution. I stood at my kitchen window as twilight descended, watching shadows lengthen across my backyard where forest began beyond property boundaries. The woods appeared entirely normal. Birds settling for evening, occasional movements of small mammals preparing for night, leaves shifting in gentle breeze. Yet perception insisted on alternative interpretation, each natural movement potentially concealing purposeful activity, darkness between trees possibly harboring patient observation. The boundary between rational assessment and paranoid delusion had blurred dangerously, threatening psychological stability if left unaddressed. "This ends now," I stated aloud to empty rooms. Decision crystallized with unexpected clarity. I would return to Sentinel Falls the following morning, not seeking further encounter, but establishing definitive conclusion. Whatever presence inhabited that location, whatever interaction had begun during previous visits, required formal termination through deliberate choice rather than fearful avoidance. I spent the remainder of that evening in practical preparation, checking weather forecasts, assembling appropriate gear, planning specific approach and departure routes. The process restored sense of agency previously compromised by uncertainty, If something awaited my return to Ridgemont, it would meet someone prepared rather than confused. Before sleeping, I composed detailed notes documenting all experiences and research findings related to Sentinel Falls. These I sealed in an envelope addressed to my closest friend with instructions to open only if I failed to make contact by specified deadline. The precaution seemed melodramatic, yet prudent given statistical history of unfortunate incidents in that specific location. Sleep came easier that night, still fragmented but deeper between wakeful periods. Dreams continued featuring water and observation themes but felt less intrusive, more symbolic than literal. Morning arrived with unusual psychological clarity despite physical fatigue. I dressed systematically in layers appropriate for variable autumn temperatures, packed minimal supplies focusing on practical necessities rather than comfort items, and placed my sealed envelope prominently on the kitchen counter where it would be immediately visible to anyone entering the house. As I prepared to depart, momentary hesitation prompted one additional action: retrieving my father's old hunting knife from storage and securing it in an accessible belt sheath. The blade offered minimal practical utility for ordinary hiking, but provided psychological comfort through connection to family tradition and symbolic protection. The early morning drive to Ridgemont passed under gradually lightening skies, clouds gathering in patterns suggesting afternoon precipitation, but currently allowing weak sunshine to illuminate the landscape. Traffic remained minimal on rural roads, creating illusion of isolation that matched my internal state. Arriving at the now familiar parking area, I noted two other vehicles already present: a small sedan likely belonging to day hikers and a maintenance truck marked with Park Service insignia. The presence of others should have provided comfort through shared human occupation of the space. Instead, it heightened awareness that potential witnesses complicate situations requiring privacy. Gathering my backpack and securing my vehicle, I stood momentarily at the trailhead considering optimal approach. Standard paths would likely intersect with other visitors, while less traveled routes might be monitored specifically by whatever presence occupied the area. After brief deliberation, I chose the main trail, reasoning that established routes provided security through visibility while approaching my destination. The hike began under normal conditions: forest sounds appropriate to early day, physical exertion matching remembered levels, familiar landmarks appearing at expected intervals. Yet subtle differences accumulated as I progressed deeper into park boundaries. Certain areas seemed darker than surrounding forest despite identical canopy coverage. Occasional cold spots manifested without apparent meteorological cause. Wind moved through vegetation, creating sound patterns that almost resembled words. Not quite coherent, but suggesting communication just beyond comprehension threshold. These phenomena increased proportionally with proximity to the falls, building gradually rather than manifesting suddenly. By the time water sounds became clearly audible, the entire atmosphere had shifted toward the same wrongness I'd experienced previously, not dramatically altered, but fundamentally different from normal woodland conditions. I paused approximately half-mile from the main viewing platform, securing my backpack against a tree trunk and removing unnecessary items to maximize mobility. The hunting knife remained accessible at my waist, not drawn, but consciously present as both tool and talisman. "I'm returning to conclude our interaction," I stated aloud to apparent emptiness. Nothing more. No response came from surrounding forest, yet subtle tension in atmosphere suggested acknowledgement. Birds continued calling. Insects maintained constant background hum. Wind moved through branches without interruption, all normal activity continuing without the silence that typically signals predator presence. The contradiction, everything appearing normal while feeling profoundly wrong, characterized the remainder of my approach. Each step toward Sentinel Falls increased dissonance between visual information and instinctive response. By the time the main viewing platform came into view, peripheral vision registered constant movement that disappeared when directly observed. The platform stood empty of other visitors despite vehicles in the parking area. Water thundered over the cliff face in apparently normal patterns, creating standard mist clouds and rainbow refractions where sunlight penetrated spray. Nothing visibly unusual presented itself for immediate identification. Yet wrongness persisted at fundamental perceptual level, not attached to specific sensory input, but underlying all experience. The sensation resembled awareness of being observed through one-way glass, knowledge of scrutiny without ability to locate observer.